Carl Jung explained. 15 spiritual signs. Your spirit is quietly reshaping your future. Carl Jung discovered something that terrified him so deeply he almost didn't publish it. It wasn't about mental illness. It wasn't about dreams or symbols or the collective unconscious. It was this: your spirit is reorganizing your entire life right now, and you think you're falling apart. Jung spent 6 years documenting his own descent into what looked like complete madness. He heard voices, he saw visions, he felt his personality fragmenting like shattered glass. His colleagues whispered that he'd lost his mind. His wife feared for his sanity. But Jung wasn't breaking down, he was breaking through. And in the Red Book, that massive leather-bound journal he kept hidden for decades, he recorded 15 unmistakable patterns that appear when your spirit begins reshaping your future. 15 signs that what you're calling depression, anxiety, or existential crisis is actually the most sacred initiation you'll ever experience. Here's what makes this dangerous. These signs don't feel sacred, they feel like failure. Your career suddenly feels meaningless. Relationships that sustained you for years become suffocating. You're exhausted despite sleeping. You can't shake the feeling that you're living someone else's life. Society calls this a quarter-life crisis, or a midlife breakdown, or burnout, or depression. Jung called it something else entirely. The self dismantling everything false so something true can finally be born. The self, with a capital S, is Jung's term for the organizing principle of your entire psyche. It's wiser than your ego, older than your conscious mind, and it operates on a timeline you cannot see or control. While your ego is planning your next promotion, your self is orchestrating your complete transformation. While you're trying to fix what feels broken, your self is breaking what was never meant to last. While you're desperately clinging to the life you built, your self is building the life you were always meant to live. And here's the part that kept Jung awake at night. The transformation happens whether you consent or not. Your spirit doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't care that your ego has other plans. It simply begins dismantling the structures that no longer serve your soul's purpose, leaving clues along the way. 15 distinct signs that most people completely miss or tragically misinterpret. Jung himself missed them at first. At age 37, he had everything society values: professional prestige, a thriving practice, academic recognition, a family, financial security. He should have been satisfied. Instead, he felt like he was dying inside. Strange images flooded his mind. He dreamed of corpses and floods and catastrophic destruction. He felt an overwhelming pressure building in his psyche, like something ancient trying to break through the surface of his consciousness. He tried to ignore it. He doubled down on work. He tried to be rational, scientific, controlled. The pressure only intensified. Finally, in 1913, Jung made a decision that would either destroy him or transform him. He stopped resisting. He let himself descend into the images, into the chaos, into what felt like complete psychological disintegration. For the next 6 years, he functioned normally during the day, seeing patients, being a father, maintaining appearances. But every evening, he would enter what he called active imagination, deliberately engaging with the autonomous forces rising from his unconscious. He met figures who called themselves Philemon and Salome. He witnessed cosmic dramas he couldn't rationally explain. He painted mandalas compulsively, watching symbols emerge that he'd never consciously studied. He genuinely didn't know if he would survive with his sanity intact. But slowly, painfully, something remarkable happened. A new center of consciousness began forming, a personality that was more authentic, more grounded, more connected to something transcendent than anything his ego had ever constructed. Jung emerged from this crucible with the foundational insight of his entire life's work. The psyche has a teleological purpose. It moves toward wholeness, whether the ego understands or approves. Your spirit knows where you're going, even when you feel completely lost. Your self is reshaping your future, even when your present feels like it's collapsing. And the 15 signs Jung identified, the ones we're about to explore in detail, are not symptoms of pathology. They're symptoms of transformation. The question is, will you recognize them in time? Because here's what Jung discovered in his practice. Over the next 4 decades, the people who recognized these signs and worked with their transformation experienced profound awakening. They found their true calling. They stepped into authentic power. They became who they were always meant to be. But the people who missed the signs, who fought against them, who tried to medicate them away or ignore them or force themselves back into the old structures, they suffered unnecessarily for years, sometimes decades. Their spirits kept trying to reshape their futures, but their egos kept rebuilding the same prison. Jung watched brilliant people destroy themselves through resistance. He watched sensitive souls collapse under the weight of a transformation they couldn't recognize. He watched potential remain trapped because people thought they were sick when they were actually awakening. And so he documented everything, the patterns, the stages, the dangers, the solutions. He created a map for the most important journey any human can take. The journey from who you think you're supposed to be to who you actually are. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand exactly which signs you're experiencing right now. You'll know what they mean. You'll recognize what's being dismantled and why. You'll see where your spirit is trying to take you. More importantly, you'll understand that what's happening to you isn't random. It isn't punishment. It isn't evidence that you're broken or failing or lost. It's evidence that you're being found. Your spirit is quietly reshaping your future, and the signs are everywhere if you know how to read them. Jung spent his life teaching people how to read this sacred language, and in the next hour, you're going to learn what took him decades to understand. Because your transformation can't wait any longer. Your spirit has already begun its work. The only question is, will you recognize what's happening in time to cooperate with it? Let's begin. Right now, millions of people are experiencing the same thing. They wake up exhausted despite sleeping 8 hours. They stare at their inbox feeling nothing but emptiness. They sit across from their partner and feel like strangers. They achieve the goals they once wanted desperately and feel nothing. They go to therapy and describe symptoms: low motivation, persistent sadness, difficulty concentrating, loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities. The therapist nods knowingly, opens the DSM, checks boxes, writes a prescription for an antidepressant, and something inside them screams, "This isn't what's wrong," but they take the medication anyway because everyone agrees something must be fixed. The symptoms must be reduced. Normal functioning must be restored. Except here's what almost no one understands. Sometimes the symptoms aren't the problem. Sometimes the symptoms are the solution. Jung discovered this shocking truth in case after case. What Western psychology pathologizes as depression or anxiety is often the psyche's desperate attempt to get your attention. It's not a malfunction, it's a message. Your spirit is trying to tell you that the life you're living no longer fits the person you're becoming. And when you can't hear that message consciously, your psyche makes you feel it. Through exhaustion, through emptiness, through the collapse of meaning, through the death of motivation. It's not trying to hurt you. It's trying to save you from wasting your one precious life living someone else's dream. But modern psychology has almost completely lost this understanding. We've reduced the human psyche to a biological machine that sometimes malfunctions and needs chemical adjustment to return to normal functioning. Jung called this catastrophic. He watched the rise of pharmaceutical psychiatry with growing horror. knowing it would miss the most important psychological experiences humans ever have. Because the psyche doesn't just respond to life, it directs life. Jung discovered that the unconscious has intentionality, it has purpose, it has a vision for your development that operates completely outside your ego's awareness. He called this the self, the organizing center of the entire psyche that exists both within you and beyond you. It's personal and transpersonal simultaneously. It's you and more than you, and the self has a timeline that doesn't match your conscious plans at all. While your ego is building a career, the self might be preparing you for a complete vocational transformation. While your ego is maintaining a relationship, the self might be orchestrating its necessary ending. While your ego is accumulating possessions and status, the self might be stripping them away to reveal what actually matters. The self moves toward wholeness with the inevitability of an acorn becoming an oak tree. It doesn't ask if the timing is convenient. It doesn't wait for you to be financially stable or emotionally ready. It simply begins the process of reorganization whenever you've drifted too far from your authentic path. And this is where the crisis begins. Most people experience this reorganization as complete disintegration. Everything that once provided identity starts dissolving. The career that defined you feels meaningless. The relationships that sustained you feel suffocating. The beliefs that guided you feel hollow. The person you worked so hard to become feels like an elaborate costume you can't wait to rip off. You look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself. Not because you've changed, but because you're finally seeing through the persona you've been performing. And your ego, your conscious sense of self, interprets this as catastrophe. I'm losing myself, you think. I'm falling apart. Something is terribly wrong. So you do what any rational person would do. You try to fix it. You work harder. You force yourself to care about things you no longer care about. You rebuild the structures that are crumbling. You grip tighter to relationships that are slipping away. You fight the transformation with everything you have. And the more you fight it, the worse you feel. Because you're not fighting depression or anxiety or existential crisis. You're fighting your own soul's evolution. Jung saw this pattern repeat endlessly. Intelligent, successful, seemingly well-adjusted people would come to him in crisis, describing symptoms that looked like standard psychological disorders. But when Jung looked deeper into their dreams, their fantasies, their life patterns, he saw something entirely different. A spiritual emergency masquerading as a mental health crisis. Their psyches weren't malfunctioning, they were functioning exactly as designed. The self was initiating transformation, and the ego was experiencing that initiation as traumatic because it meant the death of everything false. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be or who others need you to be. And here's the problem he identified. Western culture has no framework for understanding or supporting this process. We have rituals for birth, graduation, marriage, retirement, death, but we have no rituals for the death of a false self. We have no elders who know how to guide someone through psychological dismemberment. We have no language that honors spiritual transformation without pathologizing it. Instead, we tell people, "You're depressed. Take this medication. Return to normal functioning." Normal functioning, that phrase haunted Jung, because for many people, normal functioning is precisely the problem. Normal functioning means maintaining the persona, performing the expected role, living the provisional life, postponing authentic existence indefinitely. Normal functioning is often spiritual death, and the psyche, your spirit, will not tolerate spiritual death quietly. It will create crisis after crisis until you finally listen. This is the invisible spiritual reorganization happening to millions of people right now. They think they're experiencing random psychological problems. They think something is wrong with them. They don't realize they're experiencing the most sacred process available to human consciousness. The transformation from ego-centered existence to self-centered existence. From performing life to living it. From conformity to authenticity. From borrowed identity to genuine individuality. But without a framework to understand what's happening, they're lost. They pathologize sacred experiences. They medicate spiritual emergence. They abort transformation before it can complete. Jung's work was an attempt to give people that framework, to teach them the signs of spiritual reorganization so they could recognize transformation when it arrived. Because the signs are there, always. Your spirit doesn't reorganize your life secretly. It sends clear signals, consistent patterns, unmistakable markers that something profound is underway. But you have to know what to look for. And you have to be brave enough to recognize what you're seeing. Because once you recognize these signs for what they are, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to comfortable unconsciousness. You can't pretend you're just depressed or anxious or going through a rough patch. You have to face the terrifying truth. Your entire life is being reorganized by something wiser than your ego, and you're being asked to surrender control to a process you can't see or manage. Jung called this the central challenge of human existence, and he spent 50 years documenting exactly how it unfolds, what signs it produces, and how to work with it instead of against it. The 15 signs we're about to explore are Jung's gift to anyone undergoing transformation. They're the map through territory that feels completely unmapped. They're the evidence that you're not crazy, you're not broken, you're not failing, you're becoming, and your spirit is quietly, inexorably, lovingly reshaping your future into something your ego could never imagine. The question is, what happens when you finally stop resisting and start recognizing what's actually occurring? In 1928, a man came to Jung's office in Zurich carrying a briefcase. He gripped with both hands. He was 39 years old, impeccably dressed, visibly successful. He ran one of Switzerland's most profitable manufacturing companies inherited from his father. He had a wife, 3 children, a home in the best neighborhood. Everything by external measures was exactly as it should be, but he kept losing things. Not occasionally, constantly, obsessively, inexplicably. He'd lost his wedding ring twice. His business documents disappeared from locked files. He'd miss appointments he'd confirmed that morning. Friends he'd known for 20 years would call, confused, saying they hadn't heard from him in months. He'd simply forgotten they existed. "I'm becoming careless," he told Jung, his knuckles white around the briefcase handle. "Irresponsible. It's affecting my work, my marriage. I need you to help me fix whatever is wrong with my concentration." Jung listened, then asked a question the man didn't expect. "What are you losing?" The man stared at him. "I just told you. Documents, keys, my wedding ring, my sense of—" "No," Jung interrupted gently. "What are you really losing?" The man's face flushed. "I don't understand." "Tell me about your father's business," Jung said. And so the story emerged. The man's father had built the manufacturing company from nothing, sacrificing everything for its success. On his deathbed, he'd made his son promise to continue the legacy, to never let the business fail, to honor the family name through commercial achievement. The son had kept that promise for 17 years. He'd abandoned his own interests, philosophy, literature, teaching, to manage the company. He was good at it, profitable, respected, and completely hollow inside. "When did the losses begin?" Jung asked. The man thought carefully. "About 2 years ago, just after my 37th birthday." Jung leaned forward. This was significant. He'd noticed that many of his patients experienced profound psychological shifts in their late 30s, a midlife reckoning where the psyche demands renegotiation of identity. And what else happened at 37? The man hesitated. I started having dreams, strange dreams about being trapped in my father's factory. The machines would be running, but I couldn't hear them. I'd try to speak to the workers, but they couldn't see me. I'd wake up feeling what? Like a ghost. Like I wasn't really alive. Jung began working with him through active imagination and dream analysis. Over months, a pattern emerged that was so precise it seemed almost intentionally designed. The man wasn't carelessly losing things. His psyche was selectively dismantling the life that didn't belong to him. He never lost his philosophy books, never forgot meetings with people who shared his intellectual interests, never misplaced letters from a former professor who'd encouraged him to pursue teaching. But business documents vanished. His wedding ring, a symbol of a marriage arranged more for social standing than love, disappeared repeatedly. Friendships based on business networking dissolved like morning fog. His unconscious was performing surgery, removing everything that belonged to his father's dream and preserving everything that connected to his authentic calling. Your psyche isn't malfunctioning, Jung told him. It's functioning with extraordinary precision. It knows exactly what doesn't belong in your future. The man looked terrified. But I can't just abandon everything, the business, my family's legacy. I made a promise to my dying father. Yes, Jung said. You made a promise to your dying father, but did you ever make a promise to your living soul? This question broke something open. The man began weeping, not sad tears, but tears of recognition. He'd been dying inside for 17 years, and some part of him knew it with absolute certainty. Over the next year, Jung guided him through the terrifying process of acknowledging what his spirit already knew. He was not meant to be a businessman. He was meant to be a teacher, a philosopher, a guide for younger minds. The resistance was enormous. His wife threatened divorce. His business partners accused him of betrayal. His extended family called him selfish, ungrateful, mentally unstable. You're throwing away everything your father built, they said, but Jung helped him see it differently. You're honoring what your father couldn't. He gave you material security so you'd have the freedom to pursue meaning. The greatest way to honor him is to live the life he made possible, not to repeat the sacrifice he had to make. Slowly, painfully, the man began the transition. He sold his stake in the company to his partners. He enrolled in advanced studies in philosophy and education. He endured the social ostracism, the financial uncertainty, the loss of status, and the mysterious losses stopped completely. Within 6 months of beginning his transition, he stopped misplacing things. His concentration returned. His sense of time stabilized. Friendships that had felt obligatory either ended naturally or transformed into genuine connections. It was as if his psyche said, "Good, you're finally listening. I don't need to keep destroying what doesn't belong anymore." 2 years later, he sent Jung a letter describing his new life. He was teaching philosophy at a secondary school. He'd separated from his wife, but had a healthier relationship with his children, who saw him authentically for the first time. He lived more simply, earned less, had lower social standing, and he wrote, "I am alive. For the first time in 20 years, I am actually alive. I look back at that man gripping his briefcase in your office and barely recognize him. That wasn't me. That was my father's ghost, animating my body." He ended with something Jung would quote for years afterward. "I thought I was losing my mind through carelessness. I was actually losing my false life through divine precision." Jung kept this case close for the rest of his career because it illustrated something fundamental about Spiritual transformation. The psyche knows before the ego knows. Years before you consciously recognize that your life doesn't fit, your spirit begins the work of dismantling it. Not violently, not dramatically, but consistently, persistently, undeniably. It removes what doesn't belong through accidents that aren't accidents, through forgetfulness that is actually remembering what matters, through losses that are actually liberation. And if you fight it, you suffer. You try to force yourself to care about what bores your soul. You rebuild what your spirit keeps dismantling. You grip tighter to what's trying to leave. But if you recognize what's happening, if you see the pattern, honor the message, trust the process, transformation becomes collaboration instead of crisis. The man who couldn't stop losing things wasn't sick. He was receiving surgical interventions from his own unconscious, removing what didn't belong so his true calling could finally emerge. His spirit was quietly reshaping his future years before his ego could accept the magnitude of the change required. And the signs were there all along, not as symptoms to eliminate, but as guidance to follow. Jung would spend decades documenting these signs in patient after patient, including himself, and he discovered they appeared in remarkably consistent patterns, 15 distinct markers that indicate spiritual reorganization is underway, 15 ways your spirit signals that everything is about to change. Most people miss them entirely, or worse, they pathologize them as problems to fix, rather than recognizing them as invitations to transform. But once you know what to look for, once you understand the language your psyche speaks, everything changes. You stop fighting the transformation and start dancing with it. You stop trying to return to normal and start discovering what's possible beyond normal. You stop being haunted by your unlived life and start inhabiting it. The man who came to Jung gripping his briefcase eventually became one of Jung's most powerful examples of successful individuation, not because his transformation was easy, but because he learned to read the signs his spirit was sending and trusted them even when his ego was terrified. And that same possibility exists for you right now in whatever losses or disruptions you're currently experiencing. They might not be accidents. They might not be evidence of failure or carelessness or deterioration. They might be your spirit's divine precision, removing what doesn't belong so what actually matters can finally be born. Jung's insights about psychic reorganization seemed mystical, even dangerous to his contemporaries. The idea that the unconscious had intentionality, that the psyche reorganized itself toward wholeness, that crisis could be sacred, these concepts violated the mechanical model of mind that dominated early psychology. But 70 years after Jung's death, science is finally catching up to what he observed in his consulting room, and the research is stunning. Let's start with the most foundational discovery. The human brain is not fixed. It reorganizes itself constantly through neuroplasticity, creating new neural pathways in response to experience, meaning, and intentional practice. Dr. Lisa Miller at Columbia University has spent 2 decades studying what she calls the awakened brain, the distinct neural signature that emerges in people who develop spiritual awareness. Her research using fMRI technology reveals something remarkable. Spiritual awakening isn't metaphorical, it's measurable. When people undergo spiritual transformation, specific regions of their brains strengthen. The default mode network, the part of the brain associated with self-referential thinking and ego maintenance, actually quiets. Meanwhile, regions associated with interconnection, meaning-making, and transcendent awareness show dramatically increased activity and connectivity. Miller's longitudinal studies tracked people over decades, and the findings validate Jung's core insight. People who undergo spiritual transformation, even when initiated by crisis, report significantly higher well-being, resilience, and life satisfaction years later compared to those who resist transformation. But here's the critical finding. During the transformation itself, these same people report extreme distress, confusion, and suffering. It's the valley before the mountain, the darkness before the dawn. Exactly what Jung predicted. The psyche must disorganize before it can reorganize at a higher level. This aligns with research on post-traumatic growth, pioneered by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun. They discovered that people who experience major life crises, serious illness, loss of loved ones, career disruption, identity collapse, can emerge not just recovered, but transformed. They report 5 consistent domains of growth: greater appreciation for life, deeper relationships, increased personal strength, recognition of new possibilities, and spiritual development. But, and this is crucial, these benefits don't emerge from the trauma itself. They emerge from the meaning-making process that happens during and after the crisis. In other words, it's not the breakdown that transforms you, it's recognizing the breakdown as breakthrough. This is precisely what Jung spent his career teaching. Crisis isn't the problem. Unconsciousness during crisis is the problem. Terror management theory, developed by Sheldon Solomon and colleagues, provides another piece of the puzzle. This research demonstrates that human beings construct elaborate psychological defenses to avoid facing existential realities: mortality, meaninglessness, freedom, isolation. We build identities, accumulate achievements, join groups, and create legacies to shield ourselves from existential terror. But these defenses are fragile, and when life disrupts them through death, loss, failure, or sudden awakening, we're thrust into what researchers call mortality salience, acute awareness of our finite existence. Most people respond by frantically rebuilding the same defenses, but some people, the ones Jung would call individuating, use the crisis as an opportunity to build something more authentic than a defense. They build a life based on meaning rather than fear. The research on synchronicity is equally validating. While mainstream psychology long dismissed meaningful coincidences as confirmation bias or pattern seeking, recent studies suggest something more complex. Dr. Bernard Beitman at the University of Virginia Medical School has been researching coincidences for decades. His surveys reveal that people report significantly increased synchronistic experiences during major life transitions, exactly when Jung said the boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes most permeable. Career changes, relocations, relationship endings, health crises, creative breakthroughs, all of these transitional states correlate with increased reports of meaningful coincidences, as if the psyche is sending signals through the arrangement of external reality itself. Bateman's work suggests that synchronicities aren't magical. They're the result of heightened pattern recognition that occurs when the usual filtering mechanisms of consciousness become destabilized during transformation. You're not seeing more coincidences, you're noticing what was always there, because your psyche is trying to guide you through unfamiliar territory. Narrative psychology, particularly the work of Dan McAdams, provides additional support for Jung's observations. McAdams's research demonstrates that human identity is fundamentally a story we tell about ourselves. And that story is constantly being revised and reorganized based on new experiences and meaning-making processes. People who experience major identity transformations go through a consistent process. Their old narrative becomes untenable. They enter a period of narrative confusion, Jung's dissolution stage, and then a new narrative crystallizes that reframes past experiences through a different organizing principle. McAdams calls this narrative identity reconstruction, and his longitudinal studies show it happens most dramatically during midlife, precisely when Jung observed the strongest calls toward individuation. The research on meaning-making by Crystal Park and others reveals that humans possess what she calls meaning-making coping, a specific psychological process distinct from problem-focused or emotion-focused coping. When we face situations that violate our global meaning system, our fundamental beliefs about ourselves and the world, we enter a state of psychological crisis. The distress isn't primarily about the external situation, it's about the violation of our meaning framework. Transformation occurs when we successfully revise our global meaning to accommodate the new reality. This process is painful, time-consuming, and often feels like psychological disintegration. But people who complete this meaning reconstruction report profound growth exactly as Jung predicted. Perhaps most compelling is the work on what researchers call quantum changes, sudden dramatic transformations of values, priorities, and identity that some people experience. William Miller and Janet Sita Baca studied these experiences extensively. They found that quantum changes can be triggered by mystical experiences, but more often they emerge from accumulated distress that reaches a tipping point. The person's worldview suddenly shifts, sometimes in a matter of hours, from one organizing principle to a completely different one. Before, success means achievement, status, wealth. After, success means authenticity, service, connection. Before, I am what I accomplish. After, I am what I contribute. These quantum changes are rare, but they're measurably real, and they produce lasting transformation in personality, behavior, and life direction. Everything Jung observed clinically, modern research is now demonstrating empirically. The psyche reorganizes itself toward meaning and wholeness. Crisis can catalyze transformation. Synchronicities increase during transition. Identity reconstruction is a natural psychological process. Spiritual awakening creates measurable brain changes, and perhaps most importantly, resistance to transformation creates suffering, while cooperation with transformation creates growth. But here's what the research also reveals. Most people resist. Most people pathologize their transformation. Most people try to restore the old equilibrium rather than allowing a new one to emerge. Why? Because transformation requires letting go of the known self to discover an unknown self. It requires trusting a process that can't be controlled. It requires enduring a period of groundlessness where nothing makes sense. It requires exactly what terrified Jung himself, surrendering ego control to something larger, wiser, and completely beyond conscious management. The scientific research validates Jung's observations, but science can't make the journey easier. It can't remove the terror of ego death or the pain of shedding false identities. What it can do is provide evidence that you're not crazy when your life falls apart, that there's a pattern to the chaos, that countless others have walked this path before you and emerged transformed. The research confirms what Jung spent his life teaching. Your spirit knows exactly what it's doing, even when your ego is convinced everything is falling apart. And the 15 signs we're about to explore, they're not just Jung's clinical observations, they're experiences that millions of people have reported across cultures throughout history, in every generation. They're the universal language of transformation, speaking through individual lives with remarkable consistency. Modern neuroscience, psychology, and consciousness research are finally catching up to what Jung intuited in his consulting room a century ago. Your psyche reorganizes itself. Your brain rewires itself. Your identity reconstructs itself. Your meaning-making system transforms itself, not randomly, not arbitrarily, but according to patterns that Jung spent 50 years documenting. And understanding those patterns, recognizing the signs, honoring the process, cooperating with the transformation, is the difference between decades of unnecessary suffering and the conscious evolution of your consciousness. The science is clear. Transformation is real. Reorganization is measurable. Growth through crisis is statistically significant. The only question is, will you recognize what's happening when it arrives in your life? Because it will arrive, for most people, multiple times across their lifespan. And when it does, you'll need more than scientific validation. You'll need a map through the territory. You'll need to recognize the 15 signs that indicate your spirit is quietly reshaping your future. Now we arrive at the core of Jung's discovery, the 15 unmistakable patterns that appear when spiritual reorganization begins. These aren't abstract concepts. They're concrete experiences you can identify in your own life right now. As we move through each sign, pay attention to which ones resonate. Notice which ones make your body tense or your breath catch. Those are the ones currently active in your transformation. Let's begin. You wake up one morning and the career you spent a decade building feels meaningless. The hobby that once gave you joy now feels like an obligation. The friends who used to energize you now drain you with every conversation. You tell yourself you're just tired, burned out, going through a phase. But weeks pass, months pass, and the disinterest doesn't lift. If anything, it intensifies. Jung recognized this as the psyche's first signal. This no longer serves your development. Your spirit isn't creating arbitrary disinterest. It's withdrawing energy from what no longer aligns with your authentic path. Jung called this withdrawal of libido, life force retracting from false attachments to make it available for real growth. The ego experiences this as loss, confusion, even depression. But the self is actually conserving energy for the massive reorganization about to occur. What it's preparing you for, releasing identification with borrowed dreams so you can discover what's actually yours. You can't build an authentic life while clinging to an inauthentic one. You're sleeping 8 hours, eating well, exercising, but you wake up tired and remain tired all day. Medical tests reveal nothing. Doctors shrug. They suggest stress management, better sleep hygiene, vitamins. Nothing helps because this isn't physical exhaustion, it's psychic exhaustion. Jung observed this consistently in patients undergoing transformation. The unconscious work of reorganizing the personality consumes enormous energy. You're literally rebuilding your psyche at night, while your conscious mind rests. Think of it like renovating a house while you're still living in it. The construction happens behind walls you can't see, but you feel the drain constantly. Your spirit is exhausting your ego, so you'll stop trying to control everything and finally surrender to the process. What it's preparing you for, the complete ego exhaustion necessary before genuine transformation can begin. You must become too tired to maintain the false self before the true self can emerge. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years. They email you that afternoon. You need guidance on a specific question. A book falls off the shelf, open to the exact answer. You consider a career change. 3 separate people mention the same opportunity within a week. The rational mind dismisses these as coincidence, but they keep happening with increasing frequency and specificity. Jung spent decades studying synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by causality. He concluded that synchronicities increase dramatically when the boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes permeable. During transformation, your psyche is speaking to you through the arrangement of external events. It's as if the universe becomes a feedback system, reflecting your inner process through outer circumstances. This isn't magical thinking. It's the self-coordinating inner and outer realities to guide you through unfamiliar territory. What it's preparing you for, developing trust in non-rational guidance. Transformation requires following paths that don't make logical sense. Synchronicities train you to recognize and trust the symbolic language of the psyche. Your dreams become intense, memorable, sometimes overwhelming. You dream the same scenario repeatedly. Or you have one dream so powerful, it stays with you for weeks, months, even years. These aren't ordinary dreams. They have a quality Jung called numinous. They feel sacred, significant, laden with meaning. You can't quite articulate, but know is important. Dreams are the primary way the unconscious communicates with consciousness. During transformation, the unconscious has urgent messages to deliver. You might dream of death, ego death, not literal death, of journeys through unknown landscapes, new psychological territory, of encounters with wise figures or terrifying adversaries, aspects of yourself demanding integration. Jung insisted that transformation always announces itself in dreams first, sometimes years before conscious recognition. What it's preparing you for: developing relationship with the unconscious. Your dreams are showing you the future self you're becoming and the inner work required to get there. They're the blueprint for your transformation. You look at your life from the outside and feel a disturbing disconnect. This job, this home, this relationship, these goals, they're all perfectly fine. They're exactly what you thought you wanted, but they don't feel like yours. You feel like an actor playing a role, reading lines someone else wrote. You're technically successful, but profoundly displaced. Jung called this the provisional life, living according to borrowed scripts rather than authentic calling. It's one of the most common symptoms of pre-transformation crisis. Your ego built this life according to external expectations: parents, society, culture, peer group. But yourself, your true nature, has different plans entirely. This feeling of displacement is your psyche's way of saying, you've confused adaptation with authenticity. You've mastered performance but lost presence. What it's preparing you for: the terrifying admission that you'll need to dismantle much of what you've built. You can't become who you are while pretending to be someone else. The displacement feeling intensifies until you either break free or break down. You've always been able to tolerate small talk, social performances, corporate language, polite facades. Suddenly, you can't. Every inauthentic interaction feels physically painful. Meetings filled with corporate jargon make you nauseous. Social gatherings where everyone performs their persona feel suffocating. You can see through everyone's masks now, and you can feel them seeing through yours. This isn't you becoming judgmental or antisocial. This is your psyche rejecting falseness in preparation for authenticity. Jung observed that as people approach transformation, their tolerance for pretense collapses completely. The self is purging your life of inauthentic relating to make space for genuine connection. You're not losing social skills. You're losing the ability to participate in collective pretending. What it's preparing you for: complete authenticity, which will require losing relationships built on mutual performance. Your spirit is making inauthenticity intolerable, so you'll finally choose truth over comfort. You cancel plans. You avoid phone calls. You crave silence with an intensity that worries people around you. Friends ask if you're depressed. Family members worry you're isolating. You try to explain that you're not sad. You're just overwhelmed by other people's energy. But even to yourself, this seems extreme. You've always been social. Now you want to disappear. Jung recognized this as essential rather than pathological. He called it the night sea journey, a necessary descent into inner depths that can only happen alone. Transformation cannot occur in the noise of external demands. The psyche needs silence to hear itself, solitude to reorganize without interference. Your spirit is pulling you inward because the work of becoming yourself cannot be performed for an audience. What it's preparing you for: the deep inner work that precedes outer transformation. You're not avoiding life. You're meeting yourself, possibly for the first time. Solitude is the womb where your authentic self gestates. You feel inexplicably drawn to a different city, a different landscape, a different geography entirely. Or you find yourself actually moving, sometimes repeatedly, unable to settle. Rational explanations emerge. Better job opportunities, lower cost of living, desire for change. But underneath, there's a compulsion you can't quite name. Jung noticed that physical relocation often accompanies or precedes psychological transformation. Sometimes the psyche needs new external geography to match new internal territory. Moving disrupts your entire support system, routines, identity anchors. It forces you to rebuild everything from scratch, which is exactly what transformation requires. Your spirit might be orchestrating relocation to remove you from environments that reinforce your old identity. What it's preparing you for, complete life restructuring. If you stay in the same place with the same people doing the same things, transformation is nearly impossible. Geography change forces identity change. You've never been interested in psychology, philosophy, or spirituality. Suddenly you're reading Jung at 2 a.m., or studying Buddhism, or exploring mysticism, mythology, quantum physics, consciousness research. You're hungry for frameworks that explain what you're experiencing. The conventional wisdom that sustained you before now feels inadequate, shallow, incomplete. This isn't random intellectual curiosity. This is your psyche seeking maps for the territory it's entering. Jung observed that transformation always drives people toward new knowledge systems because the old paradigms can't contain the new experiences. You need a larger framework to understand what's happening to you. Your spirit is guiding you toward teachers, texts, and traditions that can contextualize your transformation. What it's preparing you for, a completely new worldview. You can't transform consciousness while maintaining the same conceptual framework. New experience requires new language, new models, new ways of understanding reality itself. You notice death imagery constantly, in your dreams, in media you consume, in conversations, in synchronicities, songs about endings, movies about transformation through death, news of people dying. This terrifies most people because they interpret it literally. But Jung insisted psychological death almost always precedes psychological rebirth. The death symbolism isn't predicting your physical death, it's announcing your ego death. Something in you is dying, a way of being, an identity, a life structure. The psyche uses death imagery to signal that the old self is being composted to nourish the new self. Your spirit is preparing you for the most crucial insight of transformation. You must die to who you were to be born as who you are. What it's preparing you for, ego death, the most terrifying and most necessary experience of transformation. You will lose the sense of who you thought you were, and that loss will feel like dying. Because it is. You feel unmoored from linear time. Hours pass like minutes, or minutes feel like hours. You experience strange déjà vu. You feel simultaneously too old for your age and too young. More disturbing, you feel like you're standing between two worlds. The old world is fading but still visible. The new world is emerging but not yet solid. You're in liminal space, no longer who you were, not yet who you're becoming. Jung called this the most psychologically dangerous phase because you have no stable identity to stand on. The old structures have dissolved, but new structures haven't solidified. Time distortion happens because you're operating outside your normal temporal framework. You're touching something timeless, the self, while still living in time-bound reality. What it's preparing you for, complete groundlessness. You must learn to function without the security of fixed identity. This phase teaches you that you are not your ego, not your story, not your achievements. You are the awareness, witnessing all of it. Memories you haven't thought about in decades suddenly flood back with emotional intensity. Childhood experiences, forgotten dreams, moments you hadn't realized were significant. Your psyche is reviewing your entire life, looking for threads of authentic self that got buried under adaptation. Jung discovered that transformation requires recovering the lost parts of yourself, particularly the parts you sacrificed to fit in, to be acceptable, to survive your childhood environment. These memories aren't random nostalgia. They're your psyche showing you. This is who you actually were before you learned to perform. This is what you loved before you were told what to love. This is the path you abandoned that we're now returning to. What it's preparing you for, reclaiming your authentic nature by recovering the self you were before socialization. You're not becoming someone new. You're remembering who you always were underneath the conditioning. Relationships end not through dramatic conflict, but through organic completion. You and your partner grow in different directions. Friendships dissolve not from betrayal, but from misalignment. You don't choose to end these relationships consciously. They end themselves, as if orchestrated by something beyond your will. This feels devastating because these were real connections with real love. But Jung observed that transformation requires releasing relationships built on your old identity, not because those people are bad or wrong, but because the relationship was based on who you used to be. As you transform, the energetic contract completes. Your spirit is removing relationships that would keep you trapped in your old self, making space for connections that match your emerging authenticity. What it's preparing you for, relationships based on truth rather than need. You must release bonds that require you to stay small, predictable, or false. Liberation from people-pleasing and the discovery of love that doesn't require self-abandonment. You get fired from a job you were good at, or you quit without a backup plan, which terrifies everyone around you, or your business fails despite your best efforts. Financially, everything becomes unstable. You can't seem to maintain the same earning trajectory. Money flows out faster than it comes in. The ego interprets this as failure, evidence you're doing something wrong. But Jung recognized this as the psyche's way of forcing change. If your financial situation remained stable, you'd never take the risk of transformation. Comfort keeps people trapped in provisional lives indefinitely. Your spirit might be systematically removing financial security to force you into the unknown, where your authentic calling can finally emerge. What it's preparing you for, living from purpose rather than fear. As long as financial security feels more important than spiritual authenticity, you'll never make the leap. These disruptions are removing the option to play it safe. This is the most powerful and most maddening sign. You feel called, pulled, summoned by something you cannot name or explain. You don't know what you're being called toward, but the call itself is undeniable. It wakes you at 3 a.m. It makes your current life feel inadequate. It creates restlessness that nothing satisfies. Jung called this the vocation from the self, an inner summons toward your unique purpose that operates completely outside ego planning. You can't logic your way to understanding this call. You can't research it or strategize it. You can only follow it through a series of small surrenders, each one bringing you closer to something your ego can't yet perceive. This is your spirit's loudest message. Your life is meant for something specific, and I'm taking you there whether your ego agrees or not. What it's preparing you for, complete surrender to a purpose larger than your personal preferences. You will be led to your calling through a path you cannot see. Your job is to follow, trust, and show up for what's being revealed step by step. These 15 signs rarely appear in isolation. Most people undergoing transformation experience several simultaneously, creating a syndrome that feels like complete life collapse. But now you have the framework Jung spent his life developing. These aren't symptoms of pathology, they're symptoms of sacred reorganization. Which signs are you experiencing right now? Pause and actually identify them. Write them down if you need to, because recognition is the first step toward cooperation. And cooperation is the difference between transformation as trauma and transformation as initiation. Your spirit is speaking through these signs. The question is, are you finally ready to listen? Jung was not optimistic about what happens when people ignore the self's call to transformation. He watched brilliant people destroy their lives through resistance. He saw marriages implode, careers collapse, bodies break down, and minds fragment, all because someone refused to acknowledge what their psyche was trying to communicate. The dangers of ignored transformation aren't hypothetical. They're documented, predictable, and progressive. Let's examine them clearly so you understand what's at stake. Jung observed a disturbing pattern. When people ignored spiritual transformation for long enough, their bodies began speaking instead. Chronic pain with no medical explanation, autoimmune disorders that appeared suddenly, mysterious fatigue that no treatment could touch, digestive issues, skin conditions, recurring infections. Western medicine calls these psychosomatic illnesses, often dismissively, as if they're less real than purely physical conditions. But Jung insisted they're completely real, just sourced differently. When the psyche cannot make itself heard through consciousness, it speaks through the body. Your body becomes the battlefield where your refused transformation fights for recognition. He treated a woman in her 40s who developed severe rheumatoid arthritis with no family history or clear cause. Through dream analysis and life review, Jung discovered she'd been suppressing rage about her loveless marriage for 15 years. She couldn't consciously acknowledge her need to leave because it violated her religious beliefs and social identity. So her body articulated the rage her consciousness couldn't contain through inflamed, attacking joints. Her immune system turned against her own tissue. Within months of beginning the difficult work of acknowledging her truth, her symptoms began improving. Not because the emotional work cured the arthritis, but because her psyche no longer needed the body to carry the message. This happens constantly. The body becomes the messenger of the unspoken, the container of the unexpressed. If you ignore sign 1 through 15 long enough, expect sign 16, mysterious physical symptoms that no doctor can fully explain or successfully treat. Your spirit will use whatever channels are available to get your attention. And if consciousness remains blocked, the body opens. The shadow, in Jung's framework, is everything you've rejected about yourself. The qualities, desires, and aspects of personality you've deemed unacceptable. During transformation, the shadow must be integrated, brought into consciousness, and reconciled with the ego. But if you refuse this integration, if you keep pushing down what's rising up, the shadow doesn't disappear. It consolidates, gains energy, and eventually erupts. This is how good people suddenly have affairs that destroy their families. How controlled people suddenly explode in rage that costs them everything. How responsible people suddenly engage in self-sabotage, so extreme it seems incomprehensible. Jung saw this repeatedly. Patient would refuse transformation for years, maintaining perfect external control while internal pressure built. Then one day, the dam would break. A pastor who preached moral purity would be discovered in an affair. A CEO known for rational decision-making would make wildly destructive business choices. A parent celebrated for patience would suddenly become abusive. The shadow doesn't emerge gradually when it's been suppressed for too long. it erupts catastrophically. These eruptions aren't character defects. They're transformation energy that, denied conscious expression, finds unconscious outlets. Your spirit doesn't just give up when you refuse the call, it redirects the energy, and that redirection is never clean. If you won't consciously integrate what needs to change, you'll unconsciously enact it through destruction. Viktor Frankl, Jung's contemporary, identified a form of suffering he called existential neurosis, or the existential vacuum. This is the specific psychological pain that comes from living a life devoid of authentic meaning, not lacking pleasure, not lacking success, not lacking relationships, lacking genuine purpose. Frankl observed this in concentration camp survivors who, after liberation, found themselves unable to return to their pre-war lives. Everything felt hollow. They'd touched something essential during their suffering, and ordinary existence afterward seemed unbearably superficial. But Jung saw the same syndrome in people who'd never experienced trauma. They suffered from what he called the provisional life, living according to scripts, postponing authentic existence, waiting for someday to finally begin really living. Except someday never comes, and decades pass, and you wake up at 50 or 60 realizing you never actually lived your life. You performed a role that was expected. This creates a unique form of despair that no amount of therapy or medication can touch, because the problem isn't chemical or cognitive. The problem is existential. You've betrayed your own soul. Existential neurosis manifests as chronic dissatisfaction, pervasive boredom, absence of vitality, inability to feel joy, even when experiencing objectively positive events. Nothing is technically wrong. Everything is fundamentally empty. Jung called this the most dangerous psychological state because it's self-perpetuating. The longer you live the unlived life, the harder it becomes to imagine living differently. You become habituated to your own absence. When you're undergoing transformation but refusing to acknowledge it, your relationships become casualties. Your partner senses you're different but can't name how. You're physically present but emotionally absent. You fulfill obligations but radiate resentment. The disconnect between your changing inner reality and your maintained outer performance creates what Jung called a participation mystique gone wrong. Instead of healthy intimacy, you have unhealthy enmeshment that feels suffocating to everyone involved. People who refuse transformation often destroy their relationships through passive aggression, emotional withdrawal, creating conflicts that justify ending what they cannot consciously choose to leave. Jung treated countless couples where one partner was undergoing transformation and the other was desperately trying to keep everything the same. The tension was unbearable. If both partners transformed together, the relationship could deepen. If one transformed and the other refused, the relationship inevitably ended, either through honest completion or through betrayal, affairs, and chaos. But the saddest cases were when both partners refused transformation, clinging to each other in mutual suppression. They'd remain married for decades, technically together but profoundly alone, each serving as the other's warden. Your relationships reflect your relationship with yourself. If you're betraying your authentic nature, you will betray or be betrayed in your closest connections. The integrity of your relationships depends on the integrity of your self-relationship, and transformation demands exactly that, bringing your outer life into alignment with your inner truth. Refuse that alignment long enough, and your relationships will either transform you through crisis or be destroyed by your resistance. This is the escalation Jung feared most. When gradual transformation is ignored for too long, the psyche orchestrates dramatic crisis to force the necessary change. He called this the enantiodromia, the tendency of the psyche to swing violently into its opposite when pushed too far in one direction. Live too controlled, expect chaos. Maintain too much order, expect disruption. Stay too safe, expect risk-taking that terrifies you. Jung saw patients who ignored every sign for years suddenly experience what looked like complete breakdowns, hospitalization-level depression, psychotic breaks, suicide attempts, complete life implosions. But when he looked beneath the symptoms, he always found the same thing. Transformation energy that denied gradual expression, demanded sudden revolution. A businessman who refused to acknowledge his creative calling for 20 years would suddenly have a manic episode where he quit his job, left his family, and moved to an artist commune. Complete destruction in service of the transformation he wouldn't allow consciously. A woman who suppressed her sexuality and authentic desires for decades would suddenly have an affair that destroyed her marriage, not because she was immoral, but because her psyche was forcing the change she wouldn't choose. These aren't moral failures. They're spiritual emergencies that became spiritual emergency rooms because the person refused to respond to earlier, gentler invitations. Jung's warning was clear. The self will have its way. The only question is whether transformation happens consciously through cooperation or unconsciously through catastrophe. You can work with your transformation gradually, honoring each sign as it appears, making small adjustments, surrendering incrementally, or you can resist until your entire life explodes and you're forced to rebuild from rubble. The transformation is happening either way. Your resistance doesn't stop it. It only determines how violent the process becomes. Jung didn't share these dangers to create fear. He shared them to create urgency, because most people waste years, sometimes decades, resisting what's trying to emerge. They pathologize the signs, they medicate the symptoms, they rebuild what keeps collapsing. And every year of resistance makes the eventual transformation more painful. But it doesn't have to be this way. Jung spent his career developing a blueprint for working with transformation instead of against it. A systematic approach to honoring the psyche's reorganization, cooperating with the self's intentions, participating consciously in your own evolution. That's what we turn to next. Jung's solution. The individuation blueprint that transforms spiritual emergency into spiritual emergence. After decades of working with patients undergoing transformation, Jung distilled his insights into a systematic approach he called individuation. This wasn't a technique or a method. It was a framework for becoming conscious during the most important process of human development, the emergence of your authentic self. Jung structured individuation into 4 interconnected stages, each requiring specific practices and awareness. But he emphasized one critical truth above all. You don't control this process. You participate in it. The ego doesn't drive individuation. The self drives it. Your job is to recognize what's happening, cooperate with it, and avoid the most common traps. Let's explore Jung's complete blueprint. The first and most crucial stage is learning to see what's actually happening. Most people experience transformation as random chaos. Why is everything falling apart? Why do I feel this way? What's wrong with me? Jung's first intervention was reframing. Nothing is wrong with you. Something profound is happening to you. And it's following a pattern. Recognition means developing the ability to see psychic patterns rather than dismissing them as random events. Practice the transformation journal. Jung insisted his patients keep detailed journals tracking 3 specific elements: dreams. Record every dream immediately upon waking, no matter how fragmentary. Don't interpret yet, just capture the raw content. Over weeks and months, patterns emerge that reveal the unconscious's intentions. Synchronicities document meaningful coincidences with precise detail. Who was involved? What was the timing? What question were you holding? The pattern of synchronicities reveals how the psyche is guiding you through external events. Signs. Track which of the 15 signs you're experiencing and when they intensify or diminish. This reveals the rhythm of your transformation, when the pressure increases, when the psyche grants relief. Jung insisted that simply observing these patterns changes your relationship to them. You stop being a victim of random suffering and become a witness to purposeful transformation. Recognition requires one more crucial shift: distinguishing ego voice from self voice. The ego says, "This is a problem I need to fix. I need to get back to normal. I need to control this." The self says, "This is exactly what needs to happen. You're exactly where you need to be. Trust the process." Learning to recognize which voice is speaking is the foundation of all subsequent work. Once you can recognize that transformation is occurring, the next stage is developing direct relationship with the forces orchestrating it. This was Jung's most radical innovation. The unconscious isn't just a repository of repressed material. It's an autonomous intelligence you can dialogue with. Practice active imagination. Active imagination is Jung's core method for conscious communication with the unconscious. Here's the basic structure. Enter a relaxed but alert state. Not meditation, not sleep, a liminal space where you're conscious but not controlling. Allow an image, figure, or scene to emerge spontaneously from your unconscious. Don't force it. Wait for what appears naturally. Engage with what appears as if it's real. Ask questions. Listen for responses. Have a genuine dialogue, not a performance. Record everything immediately afterward. The content will seem bizarre, symbolic, confusing. Record it anyway. Over time, recurring figures emerge. Jung encountered Philemon, an old winged man who became his inner teacher. Patients encounter wise women, shadow figures, divine children, animals, archetypal presences that carry messages from the self. These aren't hallucinations. They're symbolic representations of autonomous complexes within your psyche. Dialoguing with them integrates their energy into consciousness. Critical distinction. Active imagination isn't fantasy. Fantasy is ego-driven. You control the narrative. Active imagination is self-driven. You're surprised by what emerges. If nothing surprises you, you're fantasizing, not imagining. Practice. Amplification. When a symbol appears repeatedly in dreams, synchronicities, or active imagination, amplification means exploring its archetypal dimensions. You dreamed of a black dog. Jung would ask, what does black dog mean mythologically, in fairy tales, in different cultures? How has this symbol appeared across human history? This isn't intellectual analysis. It's discovering the larger pattern your personal experience is participating in. Your individual transformation connects to the collective psyche. Amplification reveals that connection, helping you understand the archetypal dimension of your personal experience. Recognition and dialogue are preparation. Integration is where transformation becomes real. This is the hardest stage because it requires embodied action, actually changing your life to align with what you've discovered. Practice shadow integration. The shadow isn't just negative traits. It's everything you've rejected about yourself, including positive qualities you were taught not to claim. Integration means acknowledging and consciously incorporating what you've been unconsciously suppressing. The business executive who realizes he's actually an artist must begin making art, not just thinking about it. The people pleaser who realizes she's suppressing healthy anger must begin setting boundaries, not just journaling about it. Jung's question for every patient: what are you resisting, and what would happen if you stopped? The answer to that question reveals precisely what needs integration, and the terror you feel imagining the answer reveals how much power your shadow holds. Integration requires symbolic action and threshold rituals, concrete acts that signal to your psyche that transformation is real. Write a letter to your old identity and burn it. Physically remove clothing, books, or objects that belong to who you were. Create a ceremony marking the death of the false self. These aren't superstitions. They're psychological technologies that help the unconscious register change. Your psyche speaks in symbols. If you want it to know you're serious about transformation, you must communicate in its language. Symbolic action. Practice the future self dialogue. Use active imagination to meet your transformed future self, the person you're becoming through this process. Ask this future self, what do I need to let go of? What do I need to embrace? What's the next small step? The responses will be specific, challenging, and surprisingly practical. Because you're not manufacturing fantasy, you're accessing the self's template for your development. The final stage isn't something you do. It's something that happens when you've done the previous 3 stages faithfully. Jung called it the emergence of the transcendent function, the psyche's natural ability to create a third thing from the tension between conscious and unconscious. You're no longer identified solely with ego or solely with unconscious contents. A new center emerges that includes both and transcends both. This is the self moving from potential to actual, from archetypal possibility to incarnated reality, signs that synthesis is occurring, increased tolerance for paradox. You can hold opposing truths simultaneously without needing to resolve the tension. Natural, authentic expression. You're not performing authenticity. You simply are authentic without effort. Decreased reactivity. Things that once triggered you lose their charge because the internal split has healed. Spontaneous right action. You increasingly know what to do without excessive deliberation because you're aligned with your true nature. Acceptance of your specific fate. You stop wishing your life were different and embrace what's actually yours to live. This stage cannot be rushed. Jung emphasized that individuation unfolds over decades, not weeks, but each cycle, each time you move through recognition, dialogue, integration, and synthesis, deepens your relationship with the self. Critical warnings Jung emphasized. 1. Individuation is not self-improvement. You're not becoming better. You're becoming more yourself, which includes accepting your limitations, flaws, and ordinariness. 2. The self serves life, not the ego. As you individuate, you'll be led toward purposes that serve something larger than personal satisfaction. Expect sacrifice, not success. 3. No one completes the journey. You die individuating, not individuated. It's a process, not a destination. Anyone claiming to be fully individuated is inflated. 4. Community is essential. You cannot individuate alone. You need others to reflect your blind spots, challenge your inflation, and witness your emergence. Jung's blueprint isn't easy. It requires courage most people never develop. It demands facing everything you've avoided. It offers no guarantee of happiness, only authenticity. But for people who cannot tolerate living falsely, who would rather risk everything than continue performing, who sense their life has a specific purpose they must discover, this blueprint is salvation. It transforms spiritual emergency into spiritual emergence, chaos into growth, suffering into meaning, and it gives you the only thing that matters during transformation, conscious participation in what's already happening. Your spirit is reshaping your future. Jung's individuation blueprint is how you stop resisting and start cooperating. The question is, are you willing to begin? History provides clear evidence of what happens when people resist the self's call versus when they surrender to it. Let's examine these contrasts closely because they reveal the divergent outcomes Jung observed in his own practice across entire lifetimes. By age 50, Leo Tolstoy had everything society considers success. He was internationally famous, wealthy beyond measure, owner of vast estates, head of a large family, author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, two of the greatest novels ever written, and he wanted to kill himself. Every single day. In his memoir, A Confession, Tolstoy described the horror of his midlife crisis with brutal honesty. I felt that something had broken within me on which my life had always rested, that I had nothing to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. He would hide ropes so he wouldn't hang himself. He stopped hunting because he didn't trust himself with a gun. This wasn't depression in the clinical sense. This was existential despair born from living someone else's life for 5 decades. Tolstoy had followed every script society provided: achievement, family, wealth, status, recognition. He'd mastered them all and discovered that mastery of external goals produces internal emptiness. When those goals aren't aligned with soul purpose, his crisis lasted years because he resisted what it was telling him. He tried to think his way out. He studied philosophy, science, theology, looking for rational answers to spiritual questions. Nothing worked. The despair deepened. Finally, in desperation, he did something radical. He listened to the Russian peasants on his estate. Simple people with no education, no achievements, no sophisticated philosophy. And he noticed something astonishing. They had what he lacked. They lived with meaning, purpose, connection to something transcendent. They hadn't achieved anything society valued, but they weren't suicidal. This observation cracked open Tolstoy's resistance. He realized his entire life had been built on the wrong foundation: ego achievement rather than spiritual authenticity. At age 52, he underwent complete transformation. He renounced his copyrights, gave away his wealth, dressed like a peasant, worked in the fields, and dedicated his life to spiritual seeking and service to others. His family was horrified. His aristocratic peers called him insane. Critics said he'd ruined his literary reputation with religious mania. But Tolstoy had finally stopped resisting, and the suicidal despair vanished completely. He lived another 28 years, writing some of his most powerful work, experiencing genuine purpose for the first time in his life. But note the cost of his resistance. He wasted nearly 3 decades in spiritual death because he couldn't acknowledge what his soul was demanding until crisis forced him. Jung treated a highly successful physician in his late 40s who came presenting with severe insomnia and anxiety. The man had built exactly the career his father wanted for him: prestigious practice, academic appointments, respect from peers, financial security. But for 5 years, he'd been having the same recurring dream. He was performing surgery, but his hands wouldn't work. The patient would die on the table while he stood paralyzed. During analysis, Jung discovered the man had wanted to be a painter since childhood. He had genuine talent, but his father, also a physician, had convinced him that art was irresponsible, that medicine was noble service. The man had suppressed his calling for 30 years, and his psyche was screaming through symptoms. Jung told him directly, "Your hands won't work in the dream because they're not meant for surgery. They're meant for painting. Your unconscious is trying to save your life." The physician was furious. He accused Jung of encouraging irresponsibility. He stopped therapy. 6 months later, Jung heard the man had suffered a complete breakdown. He'd been hospitalized for what appeared to be a psychotic episode. He'd destroyed his office, claiming the medical instruments were torture devices for his soul. After hospitalization and months of recovery, the man finally began the transition Jung had suggested. He reduced his practice, began painting seriously, eventually left medicine entirely. But the transition that could have been gradual and conscious became violent and unconscious because of his resistance. By the time he finally surrendered, he'd lost years to suffering, damaged important relationships, and carried the stigma of mental illness, all avoidable if he'd listened earlier. Jung's own transformation is the most instructive example of conscious surrender to the self's demands. In 1913, at age 37, Jung was at the peak of conventional success. He was Freud's chosen successor, president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, director of a major psychiatric hospital, running a thriving private practice. Everything society values: accomplished, recognized, financially secure, professionally established. Then he began having visions of catastrophe, floods of blood covering Europe, mass death, civilizational collapse. He thought he was going insane. But instead of medicating himself or dismissing the visions, Jung made an extraordinary choice. He would deliberately explore them. He would descend into what appeared to be psychosis and document everything. This decision could have destroyed him. His colleagues already whispered concerns about his mystical interests. If he publicly acknowledged hearing voices and seeing visions, his career would be over. But Jung recognized something crucial. The visions felt significant. They carried the quality he called numinous, sacred, meaningful, demanding attention. So, he surrendered. He resigned his academic positions. He reduced his practice, and every evening for years, he would enter active imagination and engage with the autonomous figures rising from his unconscious. He met Philemon, who taught him that thoughts and ideas have independent existence. He encountered Salome, representing the erotic and mystical dimensions of the psyche. He painted mandalas compulsively, watching geometric patterns emerge that he'd never consciously studied. His wife Sophie was terrified. His children knew something strange was happening to father. His colleagues assumed he'd had a breakdown. But Jung kept meticulous records in what became the Red Book, the massive illuminated manuscript he worked on for 16 years, but never published in his lifetime. He emerged from this confrontation with the unconscious fundamentally transformed. The entire theoretical framework of analytical psychology, archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, the transcendent function, emerged from this period. But more importantly, Jung emerged with unshakable certainty. The psyche has a wisdom that transcends ego understanding, and transformation requires surrendering to that wisdom even when it looks like madness. His surrender wasn't reckless. He maintained his practice, supported his family, functioned in the world. But he stopped resisting the inner process, demanding expression. Years later, Jung reflected, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important of my life. In them, everything essential was decided." His professional achievements came from that surrender. His contribution to psychology came from trusting the process that appeared to threaten everything. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke provides another model of radical surrender to inner calling. Rilke recognized early that his soul required specific conditions to create authentic work: solitude, beauty, freedom from social obligations, and the ability to follow creative impulses without compromise. This was completely impractical. He had no inherited wealth. Poetry didn't pay. Supporting himself required patrons and constant uncertainty. Yet Rilke organized his entire life around the demands of his creative spirit. He would accept patronage that provided solitude, then leave when social expectations became constraining. He would end relationships when they interfered with his inner work, even relationships he loved. He endured poverty, isolation, criticism from those who thought him selfish. His personal relationships were often casualties of his devotion to his calling. But the work he produced, the Duino elegies, the sonnets to Orpheus, are some of the most profound spiritual poetry ever written. Rilke's surrender wasn't about being irresponsible. It was about recognizing what his soul absolutely required and refusing to compromise that, regardless of cost. In one famous letter, he wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act just once with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. He was describing his own relationship to transformation. The terrifying inner demands were actually the most sacred guidance available. The fears were guardians of the threshold that needed to be crossed. Perhaps no historical figure embodies complete surrender more dramatically than Francis of Assisi. Born into wealth, destined for his father's successful textile business, Francis spent his youth as a typical aristocratic young man, parties, status, military ambitions. Then, in his early 20s, he experienced a spiritual awakening so profound it demanded complete life transformation. His father expected him to manage the family business. Francis began giving away merchandise to the poor. His father demanded he stop. Francis gave away more. Finally, confronted in the town square by his enraged father, Francis did something shocking. He stripped naked in public, handing his clothes back to his father. He renounced everything: wealth, status, family, security, identity, and he spoke words that became legendary. Until now, I have called Pietro di Bernardone father, but now I am the servant of God. Not only money, but all my clothes I return to him, and I will go naked to the Lord. This wasn't mental illness. This wasn't irresponsible rejection of duty. This was absolute surrender to a spiritual calling that demanded the complete death of his social identity. Francis spent the rest of his life living in poverty, serving lepers, communing with nature, building a spiritual community based on radical love and simplicity. By worldly standards, he failed spectacularly. By soul standards, he became one of the most influential spiritual figures in Western history. The contrast is clear. When Francis stopped resisting and completely surrendered to his calling, suffering ended and purpose began. Across all these cases, Jung identified the same pattern. Resistance extends suffering indefinitely. Surrender completes it. Tolstoy wasted decades in suicidal despair before surrendering. The physician required a breakdown to force what he wouldn't choose. But Jung, Rilke, and Francis, though their journeys were terrifying, moved through the fear toward authentic expression. They didn't avoid suffering. Surrender isn't escape from difficulty. But their suffering had meaning, direction, purpose. It was transformation rather than mere pain. Jung's conclusion was absolute. The transformation will happen. The self will have its way. The psyche will reorganize toward wholeness. The only variable is your participation, conscious cooperation or unconscious catastrophe, gradual evolution or violent revolution. Most people choose resistance because surrender feels like death, and it is. Death of ego control, death of false identity, death of borrowed dreams. But what dies is only what was never truly alive. What was performing rather than being, what was adapted rather than authentic, and what's born in that death is the only thing that matters, your actual self, finally allowed to exist. History shows us clearly, the people who resist transformation suffer unnecessarily and often die with their gifts unshared, their lives unlived, their souls unexpressed. The people who surrender suffer purposefully, and become channels for something that serves far more than their personal comfort. Jung himself was proof. His surrender to the terrifying descent of 1913 to 1917 produced the work that changed psychology forever. Your spirit is reshaping your future right now. History asks, will you resist until you're forced, or surrender before you're broken? We need to go deeper into Jung's personal transformation because it's the foundation of everything he taught. This isn't academic biography. This is understanding what it actually feels like when your spirit begins reshaping your future, from someone who documented it with excruciating honesty. October 1913. Jung is 37 years old, sitting in his study in Küsnacht, Switzerland. He's just returned from a lecture tour. Professionally, everything is perfect, but internally he's experiencing something that terrifies him. Images flood his mind, not daydreams, not voluntary fantasies, autonomous visions that arrive with overwhelming force. He sees an endless flood covering Europe, blood-red water drowning entire civilizations. He sees corpses floating. He sees devastation on a scale he can't comprehend. He thinks, I'm going insane. For weeks, these visions intensify. He can't stop them. They arrive uninvited, unwanted, undeniable. Then in August 1914, World War I begins. The blood-red flood becomes literal. Europe tears itself apart in the most catastrophic war humanity has ever seen. And Jung realizes the visions weren't personal psychosis. They were collective precognition. Something was trying to speak through him about what was coming. But this realization doesn't make his situation less terrifying, because the visions don't stop. They evolve into something even more disturbing. He begins hearing voices, clear, distinct, articulate voices that are absolutely not his own thoughts. A voice that calls itself Philemon begins speaking to him. An old man with wings, like the figures from ancient Gnostic texts Jung had studied but never taken literally. Philemon says things Jung doesn't consciously know, teaches him concepts he hasn't formulated, challenges his assumptions with wisdom Jung can't claim as his own. During the day, Jung sees patients. He functions as husband and father. He maintains appearances. No one knows what he's experiencing, but every evening he descends into active imagination, deliberately engaging with these autonomous forces. And it feels like deliberate madness. He writes in his journal, I was frequently so wrought up that I had to do certain yoga exercises to hold my emotions in check. But since it was my purpose to know what was going on within myself, I would do these exercises only until I had calmed myself enough to resume my work with the unconscious. Read that carefully. Jung had to do yoga between sessions of active imagination because the psychological intensity was almost unbearable. He continues, as soon as I had the feeling that I myself was again, I abandoned this restraint upon the emotions and allowed the images and inner voices to speak afresh. He's deliberately staying sane enough to explore what looks like insanity, walking the razor's edge between consciousness and dissolution. One of the most striking visions involves Salome, a figure representing erotic and mystical wisdom. She appears with a black serpent. She tells Jung things about his own psyche he doesn't want to hear. At one point during active imagination, Salome tells Jung, "You are Christ." Jung is horrified. This is exactly what psychotic inflation looks like, identifying with divine archetypes, losing boundary between ego and self. But then Philemon explains, no, you misunderstand. She doesn't mean you personally are Christ. She means you're carrying the archetype of the wounded healer, the one who must suffer transformation to guide others through it. Jung barely escapes inflation, the most dangerous pitfall of working with the unconscious. He writes, I had good reason to think I was going mad. But he doesn't stop. He continues the exploration, and slowly, painfully, a framework begins emerging. He realizes these aren't hallucinations, they're autonomous complexes, aspects of the psyche that have independent existence within consciousness. Everyone has them. Most people experience them as moods, compulsions, inexplicable thoughts. Jung is simply experiencing them more directly, more visibly, because he's deliberately opening to them. He starts painting, not because he's an artist, but because images demand expression. He paints mandalas, circular geometric designs that appear spontaneously. He has no training in sacred geometry, He doesn't know that mandalas are used in Buddhist and Hindu traditions as spiritual maps, but his unconscious knows. The images pour out, circles within circles, quaternities, geometric precision representing psychological wholeness. Every painting is a snapshot of his psyche reorganizing itself. His children see the paintings and ask questions. "What are you making, Father?" Jung doesn't know how to answer. How do you explain that you're painting maps of your own psychological transformation? His wife, Sophie, is deeply concerned. She sees her husband withdrawing into an inner world she can't access. She sees him filling massive journals with illuminated manuscript pages that look medieval, mystical, unscientific. This is not the Carl Jung who became president of the Psychoanalytic Association. This is someone else entirely, and Jung himself is terrified he won't come back. He develops a daily practice. Every morning he checks if he can still function. Can he remember his children's names? Can he see patients? Can he maintain normal conversation? If yes, he knows he's still sane enough to continue the work. This is how high the stakes are. He's genuinely risking complete psychological disintegration in pursuit of something he can't name but knows is essential. The Red Book grows, page after page of his distinctive calligraphy, interspersed with elaborate paintings, dialogues with inner figures, philosophical reflections, dream recordings, visionary experiences. It's part illuminated manuscript, part psychological journal, part spiritual text, unlike anything in modern psychology, and Jung keeps it completely private. He shows it to almost no one. It's too personal, too vulnerable, too likely to be misunderstood. His professional colleagues already suspect he's departed from Freud's scientific approach. If they knew the full extent of his inner work, they'd certainly consider him psychotic. But Jung discovers something crucial through this process. The psyche has structure, the chaos has pattern. The seemingly random images actually form a coherent system. He begins recognizing archetypal figures, the shadow, the anima, the wise old man, the divine child, not as theoretical constructs but as living presences within the psyche. He experiences the process he'll later call individuation, the ego gradually being relativized by the self, the center of consciousness shifting from personal to transpersonal. And slowly, over months, then years, the terror diminishes, not because the experiences stop, but because Jung develops relationship with them. They become less alien, more familiar, not comfortable, but navigable. By 1917, the most intense period ends. The numinous visions become less overwhelming. The autonomous voices speak less urgently. Jung emerges fundamentally changed. Not better or happier or more successful. Changed. He writes later, "The years of inner work were the most important of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this." His entire theoretical framework, analytical psychology, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the process of individuation, all emerged from this personal crucible. But more importantly for our purposes, Jung's experience validates everything he'll later teach about transformation. It's terrifying. It looks like breakdown. It isolates you from normal life. It demands surrender of ego control. It requires trusting a process you don't understand. And it's the most important thing you can do. Jung didn't go insane. He went sane in a way that transcends ordinary consciousness. He touched the dimension of the psyche where personal and transpersonal intersect, where individual psychology opens into collective wisdom, where your particular life connects to universal patterns. This is what your spirit is calling you toward when it begins reshaping your future, not a comfortable improvement of your current life, a fundamental reorganization of consciousness itself. Jung proved it's possible. He mapped the territory. He documented the dangers. He provided the framework, but he also proved it requires courage beyond what most people ever develop. The courage to look insane to everyone, including yourself. The courage to trust what makes no rational sense. The courage to follow a calling that might destroy everything you've built. Years later, a patient asked Jung, "Were you ever afraid you wouldn't come back?" Jung answered honestly, "Every single day." That's the truth about transformation. It doesn't promise safety, it demands everything, and it offers only one guarantee. If you surrender to it, you'll become who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. Jung's 6 years in the Red Book weren't a detour from his life's work. They were his life's work. Everything after, the books, the theories, the global influence, was just Jung sharing what he discovered by surrendering to the process that looked like madness but was actually spiritual awakening. Your spirit is reshaping your future right now. Jung's life proves it's worth the terror. Theory is essential, but transformation requires practice. Jung spent decades developing concrete methods for working consciously with psychological reorganization. These aren't abstract concepts. They're daily practices you can begin immediately. Let's explore the tools Jung found most effective. Jung insisted every patient undergoing transformation keep a detailed journal, not for therapeutic venting, for pattern recognition. Your journal should track 3 elements consistently. Element 1, dreams. Record every dream immediately upon waking, before your rational mind edits or forgets. Don't censor, don't judge, just capture. Write in present tense. I am walking through a forest. A black wolf approaches. I feel fear but also recognition. Over weeks, patterns emerge, recurring symbols, evolving scenarios, progressive development of dream figures. These patterns reveal the unconscious's intentions. Your dreams are showing you what's trying to emerge before your waking life can accommodate it. Jung would review months of dream journals with patients, pointing out threads they couldn't see individually. Notice how water appears repeatedly and how it transforms from flood to river to calm lake. This is showing your emotional reorganization. Element 2. Synchronicities document every meaningful coincidence with specific detail, date and time, what you were thinking or feeling, the external event that matched your inner state, why it felt significant. Example, Tuesday, 3 p.m. I was sitting with the question, should I leave my job? A friend texted unexpectedly about a new opportunity in the exact field I'd been privately considering. I hadn't told anyone. Track these over time. The pattern of synchronicities reveals how the self is guiding you through external coordination. When synchronicities increase, you're approaching a threshold. When they decrease, you're in integration phase. The rhythm reveals where you are in the transformation arc. Element 3. Sign tracking. Create a weekly checklist of the 15 signs. Rate each one's intensity from 0 to 10. This creates a visual map of your transformation's progression. You'll see which signs peak together, which ones fade as others emerge. This tracking prevents you from feeling like chaos. You'll recognize, I'm in the dissolution phase. The old is falling away. This is exactly what should be happening. We've mentioned active imagination, but let's detail the precise method. Step 1. Create sacred time. Set aside 30-60 minutes when you won't be interrupted. Not before bed, you'll fall asleep. Not first thing in the morning, you'll be too practical. Late afternoon or evening when consciousness is naturally more liminal. Step 2. Enter the threshold state. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, breathe slowly. You're not meditating, trying to empty mind. You're not fantasizing, controlling content. You're waiting for what emerges spontaneously. Jung described it as setting the stage and waiting for the actors to appear. Step 3. Engage what appears. An image, figure, or scene will emerge. It might be bizarre, a talking animal, a medieval castle, a figure in shadow. Don't dismiss it as silly. Engage it as real. Ask, who are you? What do you want? What do you need me to know? Listen for responses. They'll come as words, feelings, images, or knowing. The key, you must be genuinely surprised by the responses. If you're manufacturing them consciously, you're fantasizing, not imagining. Step 4. Continue the dialogue. Have a real conversation. Push back. Ask challenging questions. Jung would debate with Philemon, argue with shadow figures, negotiate with the anima. The figure's responses reveal unconscious contents that need integration. Step 5. Record immediately. Write everything while it's fresh. Don't edit, don't rationalize. The content will seem strange, symbolic, even ridiculous to your rational mind. Record it anyway. Critical warnings: never do active imagination under the influence of substances. You need clear consciousness. If the experience becomes overwhelming, open your eyes and ground yourself immediately. If figures command you to do harmful things, end the session. Real inner figures guide. They don't control. Work with a therapist if you have any history of psychosis or severe mental illness. Active imagination can destabilize fragile psyches. Every evening ask yourself, what am I resisting right now? Not generally, specifically in this moment. The answer reveals your active shadow material, what you're pushing away that needs integration. Common answers: I'm resisting admitting my marriage is over. I'm resisting the truth that I hate my career. I'm resisting my anger at my parents. I'm resisting my need for solitude. Whatever you're resisting is precisely what needs acknowledgement. Once identified, the next question: what would happen if I stopped resisting? Your ego will immediately generate catastrophic scenarios. I'd lose everything. I'd be alone. I'd fail. Write them all down, then ask, and if that happened, what would become possible? This reveals the liberation hiding beneath the fear. Transformation must be embodied, not just discussed. Create personal rituals that mark psychological thresholds. Burning letter ritual. Write a letter to your old identity, the person you're releasing. Express gratitude for what that identity provided. Acknowledge it's time to let go. Burn it ceremonially. The physical burning signals to your psyche: this death is real. Threshold crossing. Identify a physical location that represents the boundary between old life and new. A bridge, a doorway, a river. Cross it consciously, stating aloud, I leave behind old identity. I step toward emerging self. Wardrobe purge. Remove clothing that belongs to who you were. Notice what you're reluctant to release. That reluctance reveals where you're still clinging to the old self. Object burial. Take an object representing your former life. Bury it with ceremony. You're not abandoning your past. You're completing it. These aren't superstitions. They're psychological technologies. Your unconscious speaks symbolically. Symbolic action communicates in its language. Jung had a tower at Bollingen where he would retreat regularly alone without modern convenience. He called it his appointment with myself. You need similar structure, not occasional alone time. Scheduled, protected solitude. Begin with quarterly solo retreats. 24-48 hours minimum. No technology, no agenda except being with yourself. Journal, walk, sit, be. During these retreats, the noise of external life quiets enough to hear the inner voice clearly. Many people avoid solitude because they're afraid of what they'll discover. That fear is precisely why solitude is essential. Use active imagination specifically to meet your transformed future self, the person you're becoming through this process. Enter the threshold state. Invite your future self, the you who has completed this transformation, to appear. Ask, what do I need to let go of? What do I need to embrace? What's the next small step? What am I not seeing clearly? The responses will be specific, surprisingly practical, often challenging. You're not manufacturing fantasy. You're accessing the self's template for your development, the pattern of who you're becoming. When you notice a synchronicity, don't just record it. Map it. Create a visual diagram showing how the inner question connected to the outer event. Include the inner state or question you were holding, the timing, the external event, the connection, meaning what action it seemed to suggest. Over time, these maps reveal how the psyche coordinates inner and outer realities to guide transformation. You'll begin recognizing synchronicities more quickly, learning to read the self's guidance system. All these practices share one principle: making the unconscious conscious. Your transformation is happening whether you're conscious of it or not. These tools don't create transformation. They illuminate what's already occurring. The difference between conscious and unconscious transformation is suffering. Unconscious. You're dragged through chaos with no map, no meaning, no sense of purpose. Conscious. You're still going through difficulty, but you understand what's happening, why it's necessary, and where it's leading. Jung's practices transform random suffering into meaningful initiation. They won't make transformation comfortable, but they'll make it conscious. And consciousness, not comfort, is the goal of individuation. Begin with one practice. The transformation journal is most foundational. Add others gradually. Your spirit is reshaping your future. These tools help you participate consciously in what's already underway. Now that you have Jung's tools, you need the complete map, the full arc from first sign to final integration. Transformation isn't linear, but it does follow recognizable stages. Jung identified 5 distinct phases, each with specific characteristics and challenges. Understanding where you are in the arc changes everything. It transforms confusion into navigation. Let's map the complete journey. What's happening? The first signs appear. Sign 1, 3, 5, 9, 15 especially. Disinterest in old passions, increased synchronicities, feeling like you're living someone else's life, attraction to new knowledge, sense of being called. But you don't recognize them as transformation. You think something is wrong. You try to fix yourself. You work harder at your career. You force yourself to care about relationships that feel dead. You push through the exhaustion. This is the ego's natural first response: denial and compensation. You're being haunted by your future self, but you interpret the haunting as malfunction rather than invitation. What it feels like: vague unease that won't resolve, the sense that something is off, but you can't identify what. Increased anxiety that has no clear source. You keep thinking, if I just get more sleep, exercise more, work harder, fix this relationship, everything will go back to normal. But nothing you try works. The unease intensifies. Jung called this the refused call, the self extending an invitation toward transformation that the ego dismisses as disturbance. The danger: many people spend years, even decades, in this stage. They pathologize the signs, medicate the symptoms, and rebuild what keeps collapsing. The longer you refuse, the louder the call becomes. What starts as whisper becomes scream. The threshold: you cross into stage 2 when you finally admit, something fundamental needs to change, and I don't know what it is. That admission, that willingness to acknowledge you don't know, opens the door to genuine transformation. Duration can last months to years, depending on resistance level. What's happening? You stop trying to fix things and start letting them fall apart. Maybe you can't stop it anymore, or maybe you finally give yourself permission to stop holding everything together. Signs 2, 6, 7, 10, 11 intensify: exhaustion, sensitivity to inauthenticity, need for solitude, death symbolism, time distortion. The structures of your old life begin actually dissolving. Relationships end. Career paths change. Where you live becomes untenable. Who you thought you were starts fragmenting. This is what Jung called the night sea journey. You're being swallowed by the unconscious, digested by forces you can't control, dismembered psychologically. What it feels like: absolute terror, grief, disorientation, the sense that your entire life is collapsing and you're powerless to stop it. You look in the mirror and don't recognize yourself. You can't remember who you were or why you made the choices you made. Everything that provided identity is being stripped away. Your titles, roles, relationships, beliefs, certainties, all dissolving. You might say things like, "I don't know who I am anymore. Nothing makes sense. I feel like I'm dying." And you are. The ego is experiencing its death. The false self is being composted. The danger. This is the most psychologically vulnerable stage. Many people panic and try to force restoration of the old structure. They remarry quickly after divorce. They take jobs worse than the one they left. They return to situations they'd finally escaped. This panic-driven restoration always fails. You cannot rebuild what the self is actively dismantling. The other danger: becoming stuck in dissolution, treating it as a permanent identity rather than a transition phase. "I'm broken" becomes who you are. The threshold. You move into stage 3 when you stop fighting the dissolution and start getting curious about what's emerging. When you shift from "why is this happening to me" to "what is this trying to teach me?" Duration. Typically 1 to 3 years of active dissolution, longer if heavily resisted. What's happening? You've let go of the old structure, but the new one hasn't emerged yet. You're in pure groundlessness. This is Jung's confrontation with the shadow, facing everything you've rejected about yourself, your life, your choices. All your projections return. Everything you blamed others for, you now see in yourself. Every quality you found intolerable in others, you recognize in your own psychology. You meet your rage, your grief, your envy, your shame, your cowardice, your cruelty, all of it, undeniable and unavoidable. This is also where you meet your disowned light, the gifts, power, and brilliance you were taught to hide. What it feels like: the dark night of the soul that mystics describe. Profound existential despair combined with strange moments of clarity. You oscillate wildly between thinking you're finally seeing truth and thinking you're losing your mind completely. You might experience what Jung called inflation, temporarily identifying with archetypal energies, feeling grandiose or messianic, then crashing into deflation, feeling worthless and broken. You're being dismembered by opposing forces, the pull toward ego dissolution and the terror of ego death. Sleep is disturbed. Dreams are intense, often nightmarish. Your body might manifest symptoms as the psyche processes enormous amounts of repressed material. The danger. This stage requires enormous courage because you must stay present to psychological material that feels unbearable. Many people turn to substances, addictions, or dissociation to escape the intensity. This aborts the transformation. Others become inflated, identifying with the spiritual experiences rather than integrating them. They start thinking they're enlightened, special, chosen. Inflation is perhaps the most dangerous trap because it feels like progress but is actually spiritual bypassing. The threshold. You cross into stage 4 when you achieve what Jung called acceptance of the shadow. You can hold both light and dark aspects of yourself without splitting into good me and bad me. When you can say, "I contain all of this, the beautiful and the ugly, the noble and the petty, all of it is me, and I can live with that truth." Duration. 1 to 2 years of intensive shadow work. Though shadow, integration continues for life. This acute phase has a natural arc. What's happening? After enduring the abyss, something remarkable occurs. A new center of consciousness begins emerging. Jung called this the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche. Conscious and unconscious begin cooperating rather than warring. Masculine and feminine energies within you find balance. The temporal and eternal aspects of yourself integrate. You're no longer identified solely with ego or solely with spiritual experiences. A third thing emerges that includes both and transcends both. This is the self, capital S, becoming the organizing principle of your personality rather than the ego. Signs 3, 4, 9, 15 return, but differently now. Synchronicities feel like guidance rather than mystery. Dreams feel like conversation rather than chaos. The sense of calling becomes clear direction. What it feels like, relief, integration, growing certainty about your path even when specific details remain unclear. You experience what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it. You can be simultaneously confident and humble, strong and vulnerable, individual and connected. Things that used to trigger you lose their charge. Not because you're repressing reactions, but because the internal split that created reactivity has healed. You begin experiencing spontaneous right action, knowing what to do without excessive deliberation because you're aligned with your authentic nature. The danger. The primary danger here is premature closure, declaring yourself done with transformation before integration is complete. Many people feel so much better after stage 3 that they want to end the process. They return to normal life, declare victory, and stop the inner work. But integration requires actually embodying the transformation in daily life. It's not enough to have insights. You must live them. The other danger is spiritual perfectionism, expecting yourself to maintain this integrated state constantly. Integration doesn't mean you never have difficult emotions or reactive moments. It means you have capacity to work with them consciously. The threshold. You move into stage 5 when you begin asking, how do I serve with this transformation? What is mine to do with what I've become? When the focus shifts from personal healing to collective contribution. Duration, 1 and 3 years of active integration, though this stage naturally extends into the rest of life. What's happening? You bring your transformed consciousness back into ordinary life. This is the hero's return with the treasure. But here's what Jung emphasized. The treasure isn't for you. It's for the collective. Your transformation served your individuation, but individuation itself serves something larger. You've been changed specifically to offer something the world needs. This stage is about discovering your unique contribution, not your career, necessarily, but your essence-level gift to humanity. You begin living from authenticity rather than adaptation, saying yes to what's genuinely yours and no to what isn't, without guilt. Your relationships transform. Some end because they were based on the false self. Others deepen dramatically because they can finally be real. You develop what Jung called conscious suffering, the ability to endure difficulty without becoming bitter, to face hardship while maintaining meaning. What it feels like, groundedness, purpose, belonging to yourself and to something larger simultaneously. You're no longer seeking, you're living. You're no longer becoming, you're being. This doesn't mean life becomes easy or pain-free. It means you have context for difficulty. Suffering becomes meaningful rather than random. You experience what Jung called psychological adulthood, taking full responsibility for your life, your choices, your patterns, without blame or victimhood. And paradoxically, as you become more individual, you feel more connected to others. Individuation doesn't isolate. It creates authentic community with others who've done their work. The danger. The final danger is returning to unconsciousness, Transformation isn't a permanent state you achieve once and maintain effortlessly. You must continue the practices, continue the inner work, continue the dialogue with the unconscious. Many people complete transformation and then gradually drift back into old patterns because they stop doing what got them there. The other danger is martyrdom, sacrificing yourself in service rather than serving from wholeness. Your contribution must come from overflow, not depletion. The threshold. There is no final threshold. This stage extends into the rest of your life. Jung emphasized that individuation is lifelong. You don't complete it. You die still individuating, but you do reach a point where you're no longer fighting yourself, where you trust the process, where you can serve life rather than just survive it. Duration, the rest of your life, deepening continuously. Here's what Jung discovered over decades of practice. You don't just go through this arc once. You cycle through these stages multiple times at different levels of depth throughout your life. Each major transition, career change, relationship ending, health crisis, loss, initiates a new cycle. But each time through, you recognize the terrain faster. You resist less. You trust more. The first time through might take a decade. The second cycle might take 2 years. Eventually, you can move through the stages in months because you've learned the dance. This is why Jung called it individuation rather than self-actualization. You're not reaching a final state. You're becoming increasingly yourself through repeated cycles of death and rebirth. Where are you in the arc right now? Be honest. Stage 1, refusing the call. Stage 2, actively falling apart. Stage 3, in the abyss. Stage 4, integrating. Stage 5, serving. Knowing where you are changes everything. It transforms chaos into navigation. If you're in stage 2 or 3, the dissolution is exactly what should be happening. Stop fighting it. If you're in stage 4, don't rush back to normal life. Complete the integration. If you're in stage 5, trust that your service will become clear through living authentically rather than forcing it. Your spirit is reshaping your future by taking you through this arc. Jung mapped it so you wouldn't feel lost. The territory is still difficult, but you're not wandering blindly anymore. You have the map. Jung spent his final decades warning about specific traps that could derail or corrupt transformation. These aren't minor mistakes. They're deadly detours that can turn sacred initiation into spiritual pathology. Let's examine them clearly so you can recognize and avoid them. What it is. During transformation, you touch archetypal energies, the self, the divine, the transcendent. These experiences are genuine and necessary, but inflation happens when the ego identifies with these energies instead of recognizing them as visitors passing through consciousness. You start thinking, I'm enlightened, I'm special, I'm chosen, I see what others don't, I've transcended what normal people struggle with. This feels like spiritual accomplishment. It's actually spiritual narcissism. How it manifests: speaking with unearned authority on spiritual matters, losing empathy for people still stuck in ordinary consciousness, collecting spiritual experiences like achievements, needing others to recognize your spiritual development, becoming unteachable, assuming you've figured it out, using spiritual language to bypass genuine emotional work, developing messianic complexes or savior narratives. Why it's dangerous. Inflation is the ego's most sophisticated defense against genuine transformation. It lets you feel like you've changed while actually reinforcing egocentricity. Jung watched countless people abort their individuation through inflation. They touched something real, then ruined it by claiming ownership of what was actually grace. Inflation creates what Jung called mana personality, someone who has accessed spiritual power but uses it to reinforce rather than transcend ego. How to avoid it? Remember always, You are not the self. You are the vehicle through which the self works. Any genuine spiritual experience is a gift you receive, not an achievement you accomplished. Stay grounded in ordinary life. Keep doing your dishes, paying your bills, maintaining your relationships. Transformation that can't survive daily life isn't integrated. Find people who will call out your inflation, not people who worship your spiritual development, but people who see through pretense. Jung's test. If you think you're enlightened, try spending a week with your family. What it is, stage 3 and 4, the abyss and integration, require withdrawal from normal life, solitude, introspection, reduced social engagement. But some people never return. They make withdrawal itself the goal. They stay in spiritual seeking mode indefinitely. Endless retreats, workshops, practices, collecting teachings, but never embodying them. Jung called this the puer aeternus problem, the eternal child who refuses to grow up and engage with material reality. How it manifests: living in spiritual communities permanently to avoid ordinary work, moving from teacher to teacher, never fully committing, using spirituality as excuse to avoid intimate relationships, prioritizing inner experience over outer responsibility, judging material life as less spiritual than contemplative life, financial irresponsibility justified as trusting the universe, inability to maintain long-term commitments or see projects through why it's dangerous. Transformation without embodiment is masturbation. It might feel good, but it doesn't create anything. Jung insisted, the hero must return from the journey. The treasure must be brought back to the village. Integration requires re-entering ordinary life and living differently within it. Permanent withdrawal is spiritual bypassing, using transcendence to avoid incarnation. How to avoid it? Remember, the goal isn't to escape material reality, it's to transform your relationship with it. Set a timeline for intensive inner work phases, then commit to re-engagement. Find ways to serve others with your transformation. Service grounds spiritual experience in material reality. Embrace ordinary life as the testing ground for transformation. Can you maintain your spiritual awareness while grocery shopping, commuting, paying bills? That's the real work. What it is. This is using spiritual growth as another achievement metric, collecting practices, experiences, credentials, and states as if they're badges of accomplishment. You're not actually transforming, you're building a spiritual resume. How it manifests. Competing about whose transformation is more profound. Name-dropping teachers, practices, or experiences. Obsessing over spiritual aesthetics. Crystals, altars, perfect meditation space. Using transformation language to signal status. Measuring spiritual progress like career advancement. Spending more on spiritual products than on actual practice social media performance of spiritual lifestyle. Treating Jung's Individuation like a self-help program with clear steps to completion why it's dangerous. Spiritual materialism is ego wearing spiritual clothing. It's the most insidious trap because it looks like transformation while actually preventing it. You're using the language and practices of individuation to reinforce the very egocentricity individuation is meant to transcend. Jung saw this constantly in people who'd read all his books, attended all the workshops, used all the right terminology, but hadn't actually changed. How to avoid it? Ask honestly, am I doing this work to become who I'm meant to be, or to be seen as someone who's doing this work? The answer reveals everything. Real transformation is often invisible to others. It's internal reorganization that might not look impressive externally. Focus on actual practice rather than performance of practice. Your transformation journal is for you, not Instagram. Remember, Jung never certified anyone as individuated. There's no final achievement, no graduate degree in wholeness. What it is. After stage 3, the abyss, many people feel so much relief that they declare themselves done with transformation. They've faced their shadow, they've had profound insights, they feel better, so they close the process prematurely and return to normal life before integration completes. How it manifests. Stopping practices once acute symptoms improve. Declaring I've done my work to avoid further growth. Using partial transformation to justify returning to old patterns. Becoming rigid about insights gained, treating them as final truth. Losing curiosity once initial breakthroughs occur. Surrounding yourself only with people who validate your partial transformation. Writing the story of your transformation as if it's complete. Why it's dangerous. Partial transformation creates what Jung called half-baked individuals, people who've touched something real but stopped before integration. They have enough awareness to see patterns, but not enough integration to change them. They can articulate their issues brilliantly, but still enact them repeatedly. This creates a specific frustration. You know better, but don't do better. The gap between insight and embodiment remains unclosed. How to avoid it? Understand that transformation has no finish line. The acute crisis phases end, but individuation continues for life. When you feel relief after stage 3, recognize that as the halfway point, not the completion. The real work is bringing transformation into daily life and maintaining it through mundane challenges. Continue your practices even when you feel better, especially then. Stay in relationship with your unconscious through ongoing dream work, active imagination, and self-reflection. Jung said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Translation: your transformation is unique and ongoing. Resist the urge to close it prematurely just because it doesn't match someone else's timeline. Ask yourself, am I more humble or more arrogant than before transformation began? Am I more connected to others or more isolated superior? Is my spiritual practice bringing me into life or taking me out of it? Am I using transformation language to avoid genuine emotional work? Do I judge people who aren't awake like I am? Am I still curious and open, or do I think I've figured it out? If you've fallen into a pitfall, Jung's advice was simple. Return to humility. Return to practice. Return to acknowledging how much you don't know. The antidote to all 4 pitfalls is the same. Remembering you're not in control of this process. You don't achieve individuation. You participate in it. You don't earn transformation. You surrender to it. You don't complete the work. You live it imperfectly for the rest of your life. Jung's final warning was this: inflation is always pressing at the door during transformation. The only protection is remembering that this is happening through you, not to you or by you. Your spirit is reshaping your future. These pitfalls are where the ego tries to reclaim control. Recognize them, avoid them, and when you inevitably stumble into one, have compassion for yourself and course correct. The traps are part of the journey, too. Let me tell you about Emma. She came to Jung in 1934 at age 42, carrying a secret she'd never spoken aloud. Emma was a successful psychiatrist herself, married to a physician, mother of 2 children. She had everything that should create satisfaction: professional respect, financial security, a stable family. But for 3 years, she'd been experiencing what she called the dissolution. She would wake at 3 a.m. with her heart racing, convinced she was dying. Not anxiety attacks, something deeper, a sense that her entire personality was fragmenting. During the day, she functioned perfectly, saw patients, managed her household, maintained appearances. But internally, she felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, playing a role she no longer believed in. The secret: she'd never wanted to be a psychiatrist. She'd pursued medicine to please her father, a prominent physician who'd always wanted a son to continue his legacy. She'd never wanted children. She loved them, but motherhood felt like an identity imposed rather than chosen. And she'd never been attracted to her husband. The marriage was arranged by families, appropriate by all social standards, loveless beneath the surface. She was 42 years old and had never lived a single day as herself. Jung listened to her story and said something that shocked her. You're not having a breakdown, you're having a breakthrough. Your psyche is refusing to continue the performance. Over the next 4 years, Jung guided Emma through the complete transformation arc. Stage 1 and 2, recognition and dissolution. Jung helped her recognize that everything falling apart needed to fall apart. These weren't symptoms to fix. They were structures being dismantled because they'd never been authentic. He had her track her dreams. Recurring images emerged. She was always locked in buildings she couldn't escape, wearing clothes that didn't fit, speaking languages no one understood. Her unconscious was screaming, "This life doesn't fit your soul." Emma resisted initially, "But I'll lose everything. My career, my marriage, my children will be devastated. My father's legacy will be destroyed." Jung asked, "And what will you gain?" She had no answer. She couldn't imagine who she would be without the roles she'd performed for 42 years. But slowly, she stopped, fighting the dissolution. She let herself feel the grief, the rage, the terror of not knowing who she was underneath the performance. Stage 3, the abyss and shadow. Emma descended into the darkest period of her life. She confronted everything she'd repressed for decades. Her rage at her father for imposing his dreams on her, her shame about never wanting children the way mothers were supposed to, her grief over the unlived life she'd sacrificed for social acceptance. But also, and this was more difficult, she confronted her disowned gifts. Through active imagination, she discovered a fierce creative intelligence she'd never allowed herself to express. A wild, untamed aspect of herself that had been locked away since childhood. Jung had her dialogue with this figure. She appeared in active imagination as a dark-haired woman, living alone in a forest, painting, writing, completely free. Emma wept through these sessions. That's who I was supposed to be, and I buried her to become who everyone needed me to be. Stage 4, integration. This stage took the longest and was the most practically difficult. Emma made the excruciating decision to divorce her husband. She reduced her psychiatric practice to part-time. She endured her father's rage and disappointment. Her children struggled with the changes, but Emma began relating to them authentically for the first time, as a full human being, not just a performing mother. She started painting, something she'd loved as a child, but abandoned as impractical. And she did something radical. She moved to a small cottage outside Zurich, alone for the first time in her life. The social consequences were severe. Colleagues whispered about her breakdown. Her family called her selfish. Friends disappeared. But Jung reminded her constantly, "You're not doing this for them. You're doing this for the self. Your transformation serves something larger than social approval." Stage 5, return and service. 3 years after beginning work with Jung, Emma discovered her unique contribution. She began working specifically with women undergoing similar crises, successful, socially accomplished women who were dying inside from living provisional lives. Her own transformation gave her authority no academic training could provide. She could recognize the signs instantly because she'd lived them. She developed a small, devoted practice, not famous, not wealthy, but deeply meaningful, and she painted, not for galleries or recognition, for soul expression. When Jung interviewed her 6 years after their first session, Emma said something he quoted for the rest of his life. "I thought transformation would make me happy. It didn't. It made me real. and real is infinitely better than happy. She continued, "For 42 years I was haunted by the person I wasn't allowing myself to be. That haunting felt like mental illness. Now I understand. It was my future self calling me home." The key elements of Emma's success looking back, Jung identified what made Emma's transformation successful when so many others failed. 1. She stopped fighting once she recognized what was happening. She didn't resist the dissolution, she cooperated with it. 2. She did the inner work faithfully, dream journals, active imagination, shadow integration. She didn't skip the difficult parts. 3. She accepted the costs. She lost her marriage, her father's approval, her social standing. She grieved these losses but didn't let them stop her transformation. 4. She found her unique service. She didn't just heal herself, she used her healing to serve others. 5. She maintained her practices. Even after feeling better, she continued dream work, active imagination, and regular solitude. She understood individuation was lifelong. The transformation Emma embodied. When Jung last saw Emma, she was 54 years old. She looked younger, more vital, more present than when she'd first arrived at 42. She said, "People think I gave up everything, but I only gave up what was never mine, the identities I was performing, the life I was pretending to want. What I gained was myself, and once you have that, nothing else matters quite so much." Jung reflected, Emma's case demonstrates that transformation isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming, finally, who you actually are. The courage that requires is extraordinary. Most people will sacrifice authenticity for security every time. Emma chose differently. And in choosing her own becoming, she demonstrated what's possible for anyone willing to surrender to the self's reorganization. Emma's story is Jung's ultimate validation. Transformation is possible. Wholeness is available. Your spirit knows exactly what it's doing, but it requires everything: total honesty, complete surrender, willingness to lose what doesn't belong to find what does. Most people won't choose it. They'll stay in provisional lives until death, wondering what might have been. But for those who hear the call and finally answer it, Emma's journey proves the future your spirit is reshaping is more magnificent than anything your ego could have planned. Your authentic life is waiting. It's been waiting your entire life. The question is, are you finally ready to stop performing and start living? You might be thinking, this is my personal journey, my private transformation. Why does anyone else need to care? Jung would tell you, your individuation isn't just about you. It never was. Let me explain why your personal transformation is actually evolutionary work that serves the entire human species. Jung's most revolutionary discovery was the collective unconscious, a dimension of psyche that exists beyond personal experience, connecting all human consciousness. You're not just an isolated individual, you're a node in the vast network of human psyche. When you transform, when you integrate shadow, individuate, become conscious, you don't just change yourself. You change the field. Think of it like this. Imagine human consciousness as an ocean. Each person is a wave. Your personal transformation doesn't just change your wave, it changes the composition of the water itself. Every person who completes individuation slightly raises the consciousness of the entire species. You create new possibilities for others simply by becoming more yourself. This isn't metaphorical. Jung believed it was literally how consciousness evolves. Jung watched World War I and II devastate Europe. He watched the Holocaust. He watched nuclear weapons emerge. And he came to a terrifying conclusion. Humanity's survival depends on enough individuals becoming conscious. Here's why. Unconscious people are dangerous in groups. They project their shadow collectively, creating enemies, scapegoats, and tribal warfare. One unconscious person with power, a leader, a CEO, a politician, can damage thousands of lives through their unintegrated shadow. But masses of unconscious people following unconscious leaders, that creates catastrophe. Jung wrote, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. It is not the reality of the hydrogen bomb that we need to fear, but what man will do with it." Translation: technology isn't the problem. Unconsciousness is the problem. We have unprecedented power to destroy the planet, to manipulate consciousness, to reshape reality. But we're still operating with Stone Age psychology. Jung's warning: unless enough people individuate, unless enough humans become conscious of their shadow, integrate their psyche, and develop genuine wisdom, we will destroy ourselves. Not maybe, inevitably. This is where your personal work becomes sacred responsibility. Every time you integrate your shadow instead of projecting it onto others. Choose authenticity over social performance. Face your unconscious patterns instead of acting them out. Transform your suffering into consciousness instead of passing trauma forward. Live from your true self instead of conditioned ego. You're doing work that serves the entire human collective. You're not being selfish, you're being responsible. You're not escaping the world's problems. You're addressing their root cause. Because the world's problems, war, ecological destruction, economic exploitation, systemic oppression, all emerge from the same source. Unconscious individuals enacting unintegrated shadow collectively. You cannot solve collective problems with collective consciousness. Collective consciousness is what created the problems. You solve them through individual consciousness that then influences the collective. There's a phenomenon in evolutionary biology Jung would have loved: critical mass transformation. When enough individuals in a population learn something new, suddenly the entire population knows it, even members who had no contact with those who learned first. It's as if the learning enters the collective field and becomes available to everyone. Jung believed human consciousness works the same way. When enough people individuate, individuation itself becomes easier for others. The pathway gets established in the collective psyche. Right now, your pioneer work, your transformation is difficult because you're creating pathways that don't yet exist culturally. But every person who completes the journey makes it slightly easier for the next person. You're building infrastructure in consciousness itself. Look at what's happening in the world right now. Ecological crisis. We're destroying our own habitat. This is collective self-sabotage, shadow acting out on planetary scale. Political polarization, extreme projection, tribal thinking, inability to hold complexity, massive failure of shadow integration, mental health epidemic, depression, anxiety, addiction, suicide at unprecedented levels, collective symptoms of the unlived life, the provisional existence, existential vacuum, meaning crisis. People have material abundance but spiritual bankruptcy, loss of purpose, connection, transcendence. These aren't separate problems. They're symptoms of collective unconsciousness. Humanity is experiencing what an individual experiences during stage 1 and 2 of transformation. The old structures no longer work, but we're refusing to let them die and resisting what wants to be born. We're at species-level threshold, and the choice is the same as for individuals: conscious transformation or unconscious catastrophe. Your personal individuation is your contribution to the collective transformation humanity desperately needs. Jung's hope, what he worked toward his entire career, was creating enough individuated individuals to reach critical mass. He knew he wouldn't live to see it. But he believed if enough people did their inner work across generations, human consciousness could evolve. Not into perfection. Jung had no utopian illusions, but into something more conscious, less destructive, more capable of handling the power we've created. He wrote, "The individual is the only reality." The further we move away from the individual towards abstract ideas, the greater the danger of error. Translation: don't wait for governments, institutions, or collective movements to save us. Those are abstractions. The only real transformation happens individual by individual by individual. You doing your work, one person at a time. That's how consciousness evolves. Slowly, individually, then suddenly collectively. So when your spirit calls you toward transformation, when the 15 signs appear, when your life starts falling apart, when you feel like you're losing your mind, remember, this isn't just about you becoming happier or more fulfilled. You're being called to do evolutionary work, consciousness work, work that serves 7 billion humans who share this planet with you. Your shadow integration means less projection in the collective field. Your authenticity gives others permission to be authentic. Your transformation creates pathways for others' transformation. This is why Jung insisted individuation isn't selfish. It's the most generous thing you can do, because you cannot give what you don't have. You cannot model consciousness you haven't developed. You cannot guide others through territory you haven't walked. But once you've done your work, you become what Jung called a light in the darkness, not because you're special or superior, but because you're simply awake in a world of sleepwalkers. And that awakeness spreads. Carl Jung explained, 15 spiritual signs. Your spirit is quietly reshaping your future. Full cinematic script. 1 hour, 3,500 words. Opening hook. There's a transformation happening right now that you cannot see. Your spirit is reshaping your future while your conscious mind is still performing yesterday's role. You wake up, go through the motions, fulfill your responsibilities, but beneath the surface of your awareness, something ancient and intelligent is dismantling the architecture of who you thought you were and rebuilding it according to a blueprint your ego doesn't yet understand. Most people believe change happens through conscious decision-making. We think we sit down, make a plan, execute it, and transform ourselves through willpower and discipline. But Carl Jung discovered something far more unsettling and far more true. Your authentic becoming happens in the dark, in the spaces you're not looking. The transformation that matters most, the one that actually reshapes your future, doesn't ask for your permission. It begins in the unconscious, in dreams you can't interpret, in emotional intensities you can't explain, in synchronicities that defy rational understanding. The 15 signs you're about to discover aren't symptoms of crisis. They're not evidence that something is wrong with you. They are precise communications from your spirit, proof that a profound reorganization is underway. Your life isn't falling apart, it's being dismantled and rebuilt according to a design more authentic than anything your conscious mind could conceive. Jung said it perfectly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This video is about making fate conscious. This is about learning to read the language your spirit speaks when it's reshaping your future. Comment if you've experienced unexplained restlessness lately, like something inside you is waking up, but you don't know what. Because if you have, you're already in the transformation. You just haven't learned to read the signs yet. The problem most people don't see. Let me tell you what's really happening when people come to me, whether through comments, messages, or conversations, describing a life that suddenly feels wrong. They say things like, "My career used to satisfy me, but now it feels meaningless. My relationships feel hollow. I'm having these weird, intense dreams that won't leave me alone. I feel like someone else is inside me trying to wake up, and I don't know who they are." The false belief they hold, the one our entire culture reinforces, is that this experience is breakdown, depression, or psychological instability. something to be medicated, therapized away, or overcome through positive thinking and better habits. We pathologize the very signals that indicate authentic transformation is beginning. But here's the hidden truth Jung spent his entire life trying to teach us. This isn't breakdown. This is your spirit reshaping your future. Your psyche is saying with increasing urgency, the person you became to survive is no longer enough. Something deeper is demanding recognition. The mask you've been wearing, the one that earned approval, maintained safety, and kept you functional, that mask has become a prison. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires the dissolution of who you pretended to be. And that dissolution feels, at first, like death." David's story, when the executive became a stranger to himself. Let me tell you about David, 48 years old, successful corporate executive, six-figure salary, respected in his industry, married with 2 children. From the outside, David had built exactly the life he was supposed to want. From the inside, something was collapsing. It started with dreams, the same dream, night after night, for 3 months. A hooded figure standing at the edge of a forest, beckoning him forward. David would wake up with his heart racing, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of recognition he couldn't name. During the day, his carefully constructed life, the executive identity, the corporate persona, the competent leader everyone relied upon, suddenly felt like a costume that no longer fit. He'd sit in meetings and feel himself watching from outside his body, thinking, "Who is this person speaking? These aren't my words. This isn't my life." His wife noticed he'd become withdrawn. His colleagues saw his attention wandering. David himself thought he was experiencing depression. He considered therapy, medication, career counseling, anything to fix what felt broken. But here's what was actually happening. David's self, the authentic center of his psyche, the part Jung described as the totality of consciousness and unconsciousness integrated, was pressing against the prison of his persona. The executive identity had served him well. It had earned him security, respect, achievement. But it was a prison built from his father's expectations and his own fear of inadequacy. The dreams weren't pathology. They were invitations. The dissatisfaction wasn't depression. It was awakening. David didn't understand this at first. He fought the transformation with everything he had, trying to convince himself he was fine, that he just needed a vacation, that things would go back to normal. But the signs intensified. Insomnia, existential questioning that wouldn't quiet, a burning need to do work that mattered rather than work that impressed, physical tension he couldn't release, and that dream, always that dream, calling him towards something he didn't have language for yet. What David was experiencing wasn't unique. It was the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the psyche's movement toward wholeness, and it announces itself through specific, recognizable signs. The 15 spiritual signs, the language. Your spirit speaks. Your spirit doesn't speak in words. It speaks in symbols, synchronicities, dreams, and disruptions. When your future is being reshaped, when your authentic self is demanding recognition, it communicates through 15 primary signs. These aren't random. They're precise. They're the unconscious, made visible. Sign 1. Recurring dreams with emotional intensity. The same dream, night after night, often featuring a stranger who feels deeply familiar or a location that carries inexplicable significance, though you've never been there in waking life. These aren't just dreams. They're the self communicating through the only language that bypasses the ego's defenses. Symbolic imagery. Pay attention to the figures, the landscapes, the emotions. They're showing you the next stage of your becoming. Sign 2. Unexplained physical symptoms. Sudden tension you can't release. Fatigue despite adequate sleep. Strange energetic shifts in your body, pressure in your chest, heat in specific areas. Jung understood what modern medicine often misses. The body speaks what the mind refuses to hear. When spiritual transformation begins, it doesn't stay locked in your thoughts. It moves through your entire system, reorganizing you at every level. Sign 3. Synchronicities. Coincidences that feel too precise to be random. You think of someone and they call moments later. You see a specific number repeatedly. A book falls off a shelf with exactly the message you needed in that moment. Jung called these meaningful coincidences, and he understood them as evidence that the psyche is organizing external circumstances to match internal transformation. Synchronicities aren't magic. They're the universe reflecting back what you're becoming. Sign 4. Emotional intensity. Disproportionate to circumstances. You cry at a commercial that would normally leave you unmoved. You rage at a minor inconvenience. You feel inexplicable grief that has no clear source. The intensity isn't about the trigger. It's shadow material surfacing. All the emotions, desires, and aspects of yourself you've been repressing for years are demanding integration. Your psyche is saying, you can't leave these parts behind anymore. They need to come with you into the next chapter. Sign 5. Sudden repulsion to old relationships. People you once enjoyed now feel suffocating, inauthentic, draining. This isn't cruelty, and it's not their fault. Your psyche is outgrowing dynamics that once served you, but now prevent your authentic becoming. The relationships that dissolve during spiritual transformation are the ones built on your false self, the ones that required you to maintain the mask. Sign 6. Inexplicable attraction to specific people, teachers, or ideas. A magnetic pull toward someone or something that doesn't fit your logical understanding. You find yourself drawn to teachings, philosophies, or individuals who carry something you need. Often they're carriers of shadow projections or guides for the next phase of your individuation. Trust these attractions. They're not random. They're the self-organizing your education. Sign 7. The dissolution of achievement-driven goals. Success suddenly feels empty. You realize with dawning horror or relief that you've been climbing a ladder leaning against the wrong wall. The goals that once motivated you, the promotions, the recognition, the accumulation of external validation, lose their power. This isn't apathy, it's clarity. Your spirit is reshaping what you value. Sign 8. A growing hunger for authenticity, intolerance for small talk, performance, pretense, or any interaction that requires you to wear the mask. The persona, the social face you present to the world, has become unbearable. You'd rather be alone than fake. You'd rather risk disapproval than continue performing. This hunger is sacred. It's the self refusing to be hidden anymore. Sign 9. Recurring themes in conversations and media. A specific topic, message, or lesson appears repeatedly in different contexts. Podcasts, conversations, books, even advertisements. It's not coincidence. The psyche is trying to teach you something. It will keep presenting the same lesson in different forms until you finally pay attention and integrate what it's showing you. Sign 10. Inexplicable grief or loss. Mourning for something you can't name. Often this is grief for the self you're leaving behind, the identity you built, the dreams you abandoned, the parts of yourself you had to suppress to survive. This grief is necessary. You can't become who you truly are without mourning who you pretended to be. Sign 11. Magnetism to solitude. An urgent need to withdraw, to be alone, to descend into inner exploration. This isn't depression or isolation. It's the psyche creating space for transformation. Jung called this the introversion of the libido, energy withdrawing from the external world to reorganize the internal world. Honor this need. The people who love you will still be there when you return, but you'll return changed. Sign 12. Body sensations without clear cause. Pressure in the chest, energy flowing through the spine, heat or tingling in specific areas. These are often signs of spiritual activation, what Eastern traditions call Kundalini awakening. Your energy body is reorganizing itself to hold the consciousness you're becoming. Sign 13. Dissociation from normal life. Watching yourself go through routines as if observing from outside. The old identity no longer feels like you. You're in your life, but not of it, simultaneously present and absent. This is enantiodromia, Jung's term for the moment when an attitude or identity reaches its extreme and begins its reversal into its opposite. Sign 14. Intense synchronistic encounters, meeting exactly the right person at the right moment, conversations that feel scripted by fate, doors opening impossibly. These aren't lucky breaks. They're the self reorganizing your external circumstances to match your internal transformation. When you align with your authentic becoming, reality reorganizes itself around that alignment. Sign 15. A knowing without knowledge. A quiet certainty that something profound is shifting, even though you can't articulate what or why. This is the self speaking directly to consciousness, bypassing rational understanding. Trust this knowing. It's more reliable than any logical analysis. How many of these signs are you experiencing right now? Comment with the number. Let's see if we're in a collective transformation together. My own descent, when the teacher became the student. I need to tell you something vulnerable, because if I'm asking you to face your shadow, I have to face mine too. I experienced 12 of these 15 signs before I understood what was happening to me. I thought I was losing my mind. I had panic attacks about wasted time. I felt like an imposter in my own life, which was ironic because I was teaching people about authenticity while wearing a mask so thick I couldn't breathe. I couldn't sleep. I was magnetically drawn to spiritual teachings, Jungian psychology, philosophy, subjects that had seemed frivolous before, distractions from real work. I had recurring dreams of being underwater, unable to reach the surface and waking up gasping. I experienced that dissociation David felt, watching myself teach, speak, interact, thinking, this isn't me. These are words I learned to say, but they're not true. What I didn't understand then, but understand with crystal clarity now, is that my spirit was saying, the comfortable prison is ending. The persona you built to be impressive, to be helpful, to be respected, it's served its purpose. Now it's killing you. You're being called toward something real, even if that something is smaller, quieter, less impressive from the outside. The night I finally surrendered, when I stopped fighting the transformation and asked, with genuine openness, okay, what are you trying to show me? Something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or divine intervention, just a quiet settling like a key turning in a lock. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it transformed into purposeful aliveness. The restlessness became direction. The dissolution became opening. I realized I'd been so busy teaching transformation that I'd been avoiding my own. Breakdown versus breakthrough, learning to tell the difference. Here's what matters. These 15 signs can indicate either breakdown or breakthrough, and knowing the difference can save years of unnecessary suffering. Breakdown is characterized by despair, hopelessness, inability to function. The desire is to escape, numb, or fragment. There's no direction, just disintegration. Isolation increases. Meaning and purpose dissolve into nihilism. If you're experiencing this, you need practical support, therapy, possibly medication, community medical care. Spiritual transformation language can become a dangerous bypass if what you actually need is psychological intervention. Breakthrough is characterized by disorientation with an underlying aliveness. The desire is to understand, integrate, make meaning. There's dissolution, yes, but with emerging coherence. You're not just falling apart, you're reorganizing. Withdrawal is selective for integration rather than escape. And beneath the confusion, there's a magnetism toward deeper purpose, toward something more real than what you had before.